Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There are moments in life that feel ordinary until they become the last normal thing you remember. A text message sent at 9:47 p.m. The sound of a car door closing in a driveway. A phone call that rings 4 times before going to voicemail. These moments don't announce themselves as significant. They simply happen, and then they're gone, and then someone is gone, and you're left holding the memory of something that should have meant nothing but now means everything. In Pine Hollow, a town where aircraft technicians outnumber bartenders, and the loudest sound most evenings is the hum of refrigerators in empty kitchens, Ethan Rowe was the kind of man people described as steady. Not exciting. Not memorable in the way that makes you tell stories at parties. Just steady. He showed up to work at the aviation facility 15 minutes early every single day for 11 years. He packed his lunch the night before, labeling containers with masking tape and black marker. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, carrots in a Ziploc bag that he reused until the seal wore out. His coworkers knew him as someone who didn't waste words. In the break room, while others talked about football or complained about management, Ethan sat with a thermos of coffee, reading technical manuals or scrolling through photos of his kids on his phone. 2 children, a boy, 7, a girl, 9. Their faces appeared on his screensaver, frozen mid-laugh at some birthday party he'd probably planned down to the minute. People liked Ethan in the uncomplicated way you like someone who never causes problems. He didn't gossip, didn't borrow money, didn't get drunk at the company Christmas party and say something he'd regret. He was just there, reliable as the sunrise, until one weekend in October when he stopped being there at all. The machinery exhibition was annual, held 2 towns over in a convention center that smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee. Ethan had mentioned it to a coworker on Friday, the way people mention plans that don't require enthusiasm, just acknowledgement. He'd be gone Saturday and Sunday. Back Monday. Routine. Except Monday came and Ethan's workstation stayed empty. Tuesday the same. By Wednesday, his supervisor made calls. No answer. Voicemail full. The kind of silence that starts feeling like a presence. What people didn't know yet was that Ethan's phone was very much active. Messages were being sent. Replies were being written. To his brother in Nevada. To an old friend from trade school. To a neighbor who'd asked about borrowing a ladder. The messages were polite but cold. Short sentences. No punctuation errors because Ethan had always been careful about grammar, even in texts. But something was off in the tone. Like someone doing an impression of Ethan Rowe without quite understanding what made him sound like himself. I need time away, one message read. Don't worry about me. Taking a break from everything. His brother called immediately. The phone rang and rang. No answer. He tried again an hour later. Same result. When he finally got a text response, it said, "Can't talk now. We'll reach out when ready." This continued for weeks. Brief messages. Always delayed responses. Never a phone call. Never a video chat. Just words on a screen that technically came from Ethan's number, but felt like they were being written by a stranger who'd memorized his vocabulary without learning his voice. In Pine Hollow, Mara Rowe told neighbors that her husband had left. Just like that. No big fight. No dramatic exit. He'd gone to the convention and decided he needed space. She said it with the kind of exhausted acceptance that made people nod sympathetically and stop asking questions. Marriages end. People leave. It happens. But Ethan's friend from work, a man named David who'd known him since the early days, couldn't make it fit. He'd had coffee with Ethan 3 days before the exhibition. They talked about normal things. David's daughter's college applications. Ethan's plan to build a treehouse. Nothing about needing space. Nothing about feeling trapped. Ethan had seemed exactly like Ethan, which meant quiet, focused, present. David started paying attention to small details. Like how Mara had repainted the living room within 2 weeks of Ethan's disappearance. A bright yellow that Ethan would have hated because he'd once spent 20 minutes explaining to David why neutral colors held value better for resale. Like how Mara seemed to acquire new things. A truck, furniture, expensive sunglasses she wore even on cloudy days. When David mentioned it to other neighbors, they shrugged. Maybe Ethan left her money. Maybe she's coping by redecorating. Maybe it's none of our business. Maybe. That word carried a lot of weight. It allowed people to create explanations that let them sleep at night. Maybe Ethan was having a breakdown. Maybe he'd met someone. Maybe he was perfectly fine and just didn't want to be found. But David couldn't stop thinking about the text messages. He'd received one himself, asking him not to contact Ethan anymore. "I need to figure things out alone," it said. David had stared at those words for a long time. Ethan had never called it figuring things out. He called it working through the problem or handling it. Small difference. The kind of difference that means nothing unless you know someone well enough to notice. Months passed. Fall turned to winter. The aviation facility hired someone new for Ethan's position. His workstation was cleared out. His name disappeared from the schedule. Life moved forward because that's what life does, even when someone is missing from it. Mara started dating. A man from 2 towns over. Then another. She posted photos on social media, smiling in restaurants, holding cocktails, wearing clothes that looked nothing like the modest, practical outfits she'd worn when Ethan was around. People commented with encouragement. "You deserve happiness. Good for you. Live your life." David kept Ethan's number in his phone. Sometimes, late at night, he'd scroll to it and just look at the name. Ethan Rowe. Contact photo. Ethan in a work uniform, squinting slightly in the sun, not quite smiling, but not frowning either. Just existing in that neutral space he'd always occupied. One evening, David drove past Ethan's house. The lights were on. Mara's car was in the driveway. Everything looked normal. Lived in. Functional. There was no crime scene tape. No investigation. No reason to believe anything was wrong except for a feeling David couldn't name. A tightness in his chest that appeared whenever he thought too hard about his friend. He noticed the backyard had changed. Where there used to be grass and a small garden area, there was now a concrete slab. Clean. Professional. The kind of thing someone might install for a shed foundation or outdoor entertaining space. Mara had mentioned something about it on social media. Finally got the patio finished, with a photo of the smooth gray surface. David thought about Ethan's meticulousness. How he'd talked about building a treehouse. How he'd never mentioned wanting a patio. How he'd always said concrete was permanent in a way that made him uncomfortable, because what if you changed your mind about the layout? But people change their minds. People want different things. Maybe Mara had wanted a patio. Maybe Ethan would have agreed if he'd been there to discuss it. Maybe David was seeing patterns where none existed because he missed his friend and couldn't accept that someone could just vanish into a new life without looking back. Across town, in Red Clay County, a young woman named Lucia Moreno was learning what it meant to make yourself smaller. She hadn't started that way. When she'd first arrived in the area at 20, she'd been loud with laughter, quick to hug people she'd just met, ambitious in the uncomplicated way of someone who believes hard work automatically leads to reward. She worked at a diner during breakfast and lunch shifts, then cleaned offices at night. In between, she took online bookkeeping courses, studying on her phone during bus rides, making flashcards on napkins when the Wi-Fi cut out. She sent money home every month. Her grandmother was sick. The kind of sick that requires medications with names Lucia couldn't pronounce and costs that made her stomach hurt when she calculated them. When she met Caleb Dorn at a community cookout, he seemed like the kind of stability she'd been working toward. He had a steady job at a warehouse, a truck that ran, an apartment with actual furniture instead of milk crates and borrowed chairs. He looked at her like she was worth looking at, which felt good after months of being invisible to everyone except customers who needed coffee refills. Their first few months were normal. Good, even. He picked her up from work when it was raining, bought groceries without being asked, told her she worked too hard, which felt like caring instead of criticism. Lucia's friends liked him. He's solid, they said. Dependable. The same words people had used about Ethan Rowe, though Lucia had never met Ethan and never would. They married quickly. A courthouse ceremony with 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway. Lucia wore a white dress she'd bought on clearance. Caleb wore the same button-down shirt he wore to job interviews. Afterward, they ate at a steakhouse and Caleb paid in cash, counting bills carefully, making sure to leave exactly 15% for the tip. The changes started small. Caleb mentioning that Lucia's work friend Maria seemed flirty with men at the cookout. Lucia laughed it off because Maria was flirty with everyone, including the elderly man who sold tamales from a cart. But Caleb kept mentioning it, casually, like an observation he couldn't help making. Then it was Lucia's clothes. That shirt's kind of low-cut for a diner, don't you think? She looked down at the same polo shirt she'd worn for 8 months. Same neckline, same fit. But now Caleb was noticing it differently. So she bought a new one with a higher collar and tried not to think about the fact that she'd spent money they didn't have to replace something that wasn't actually broken. Her friends noticed she stopped coming to things. Sunday brunches, movie nights, the monthly potluck at Maria's apartment. Too tired, Lucia would text. Work's been crazy. Which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Caleb asked so many questions before she left the house that it was easier to just stay home. Where are you going? He'll be there. What time will you be back? When did you plan this? Why didn't you mention it before? The questions felt like concern until they started feeling like surveillance. The police came to their apartment twice in 1 year. Both times, neighbors had called about shouting. Both times, Caleb answered the door calm and apologetic. Just a disagreement. You know how it is. Both times, the officers glanced past him at Lucia, who stood in the kitchen nodding, confirming that everything was fine, just a stupid argument about nothing important. And it was nothing important. That was the strange part. They fought about whether to buy name brand or generic cereal. About Lucia leaving lights on. About the proper way to load a dishwasher. Small things that somehow became large enough to shatter the quiet of a Tuesday evening. Lucia's co-worker at the diner, an older woman named Brenda who'd been slinging eggs for 23 years, pulled her aside one morning. You okay, honey? I'm fine, Lucia said automatically. Brenda looked at her for a long moment. You're not smiling the same. Lucia wanted to ask what that meant. How do you smile differently? But she knew. She could feel it herself. The way her face had learned to arrange itself into expressions that didn't match what was happening inside her body. Performance smiles. Appeasement smiles. Smiles that said, everything's fine, while her hands shook when she poured coffee. One winter evening, a neighbor later reported hearing nothing unusual. No shouting. No crashes. No sounds of struggle. The house simply went dark earlier than normal. Lights off by 8 p.m., which was odd because Lucia usually studied until at least 10, her desk lamp visible through the front window. The next morning, Caleb left for work at his regular time. The neighbors saw him load something into his truck bed, covered with a tarp, but thought nothing of it. Caleb was always hauling stuff. Furniture he'd bought at estate sales. Materials for projects he never quite finished. Normal things. Lucia never showed up for her shift at the diner. Brenda called twice. Voicemail. She called the apartment landline. No answer. By noon, Brenda called Maria, who called 2 other friends, and by evening someone had driven to the apartment and found it empty. Locked. Undisturbed. Like Lucia had simply evaporated. Caleb, when reached, seemed confused and worried in equal measure. Lucia had been acting strange, he said. Stressed about money. Depressed about her grandmother's health. He'd woken up that morning and she was gone. He assumed she'd left early for work. He'd been calling her phone all day, same as everyone else. The performance was flawless. Concerned husband. Searching alongside friends. Posting on social media. Checking hospitals. Filing a missing person report with details that painted Lucia as unstable, overwhelmed, possibly suicidal. She's been talking about just disappearing, he told police. Starting over somewhere. Had she? Her friends couldn't remember Lucia ever saying that. But grief and worry distort memory. Maybe she had mentioned it, and they'd forgotten. Maybe Caleb knew his wife better than they did. Maybe a woman working 2 jobs while studying and supporting a sick relative overseas really was on the edge of breaking. The search continued for weeks. Flyers with Lucia's face appeared on telephone poles. Her photo circulated on local news. Tips came in that led nowhere. A woman matching her description seen at a bus station 3 towns over. Another sighting at a gas station near the state line. All dead ends. Caleb played his role perfectly. He gave interviews. Pleaded for Lucia's safe return. Wore the same haunted expression that people expect from worried spouses. And slowly, gradually, the story shifted from missing woman to woman who left. It made sense to people. Young immigrant woman, overwhelmed by responsibility, married too quickly, decided to start fresh. Sad, but understandable. These things happen. People run away from their lives all the time. Except Lucia hadn't run anywhere. Lucia had never left the house alive that winter evening when the lights went dark earlier than usual, and the neighborhood heard nothing unusual because violence, real violence, is often quieter than people expect. But no one knew that yet. No one was looking in the right places. And Caleb went to work each day, came home each evening, lived in the apartment that still smelled faintly of Lucia's coconut shampoo, and waited for people to stop asking questions. Meanwhile, back in Pine Hollow, Ethan's phone continued its strange half-life. Messages still appeared, brief responses to family members, vague reassurances to friends who hadn't given up. The digital ghost of Ethan Rowe, maintained by someone who'd learned his patterns well enough to imitate them, but not well enough to truly replicate them. David received another message in late spring. "Stop trying to reach me. I'm fine. I just need you to respect my space." He stared at the words. Ethan had never told anyone to respect his space. Ethan had used phrases like, "I need some time," or "I'll call you when I'm ready." Respect my space sounded like something someone else would say. Someone younger. Someone who'd learned how people talk from television instead of from actually being a person. David did something he'd been considering for months. He called Ethan's brother in Nevada. They'd never spoken before, but grief creates strange alliances. "The messages are wrong," David said. "I know," Ethan's brother replied. They compared notes. Timing. Phrasing. The little inconsistencies that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern. Neither man said what they were both thinking. That someone else was sending those messages. That Ethan might not be capable of sending messages anymore. That the exhibition weekend might have been the last time Ethan Rowe existed as anything other than a name on a phone screen. But suspicion isn't evidence. Concern isn't proof. And without a body, without a crime scene, without anything except a feeling that something was profoundly wrong, there was nothing to investigate. The concrete slab in Ethan's backyard remained undisturbed. Mara hosted a small gathering there in June, posting photos of string lights and citronella candles, friends sitting on folding chairs drinking wine. The patio looked finished, permanent, like it had always been part of the landscape. David drove past the house that evening and saw the gathering through the gaps in the fence. Heard laughter, smelled grilled meat. Everything about the scene screamed normalcy. A woman moving on with her life after her husband abandoned their family. Reasonable. Understandable. Except David couldn't shake the image of Ethan talking about that treehouse, measuring twice because he always measured twice, planning something for his kids that would never get built. In a different part of the country, at Westlake Regional Medical Center, a woman named Naomi Bell was learning that hospitals are very good at processing people and very bad at seeing them. She'd collapsed at a bus stop on a Tuesday afternoon. Dehydration, malnutrition, an infection that had spread because she'd been living in her car for 3 weeks, and infections don't care about your housing status. The ambulance brought her to Westlake because it was closest. Emergency room staff stabilized her, admitted her, assigned her a room number and a plastic wristband with her name spelled almost correctly. Naomi instead of Naomi. Small error. The kind that happens 1,000 times a day in hospitals everywhere. Her mother, Elaine Bell, got the call from a nurse who sounded tired. "Your daughter is here. She's stable. You can visit during designated hours." Elaine wrote down the room number on the back of an envelope and felt the complicated mix of relief and despair that comes with having a chronically ill child who keeps ending up in places like this. Naomi was 28 but looked older. Years of addiction had carved lines into her face that shouldn't appear until someone's 40s. Periods of homelessness had weathered her skin. But her eyes were still Naomi's eyes, still capable of the brightness Elaine remembered from childhood, even if that brightness appeared less frequently now. Elaine visited the first day, brought magazines Naomi wouldn't read, and snacks Naomi couldn't eat yet. They talked about small things. The weather, a TV show Naomi had missed, whether Elaine's cat was still knocking plants off windowsills. Normal conversation that felt precious because there had been so many months when they couldn't have normal conversations. When Naomi disappeared into addiction or homelessness or the chaos of untreated mental illness. "I'll come back tomorrow," Elaine said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Okay, Mom," Naomi replied, and those 2 words felt like hope. But the next day, when Elaine arrived during visiting hours, Naomi's room was empty. Bed stripped. Medical equipment removed. The whiteboard on the wall erased of her name. Elaine stood in the doorway, confused, gripping the bag of clean clothes she'd brought. A nurse passing in the hallway glanced at her. "Can I help you?" "My daughter, Naomi Bell. She was in this room." The nurse checked a tablet, frowned, Says here she was discharged. Discharged? When? No one called me. Sometimes patients leave AMA. Against medical advice. They don't always inform family. Elaine felt her stomach drop. Naomi had done this before. Left treatment early. Walked out of facilities. Disappeared back into whatever situation she'd been pulled from. But something felt wrong. Naomi had seemed weak yesterday. Too weak to walk out on her own. And she'd seemed committed to staying, to getting better this time. Did anyone see her leave? The nurse shrugged, already moving away. I wasn't on duty. Check with administration. Administration had no record of Naomi leaving. No discharge paperwork. No signature declining treatment. Just a notation in the system that she'd left the hospital voluntarily at some point during the night shift. Elaine called Naomi's phone. Straight to voicemail. She called again an hour later. Same result. She drove to the places Naomi used to stay. A friend's couch. A shelter on the east side. A parking lot where people lived in their vehicles. No one had seen her. Days became weeks. Elaine filed a missing person report. The officer taking the information was kind, but practiced in the art of managing expectations. Adults have the right to disappear, he explained. Especially if there's a history of instability. Elaine wanted to scream that instability didn't mean invisibility. That addiction didn't mean disposable. That her daughter was a person who mattered, who existed, who shouldn't be able to vanish from a hospital without anyone noticing or caring. She made flyers. Posted them around the neighborhood where Westlake was located. Shared Naomi's photo on social media with increasingly desperate captions. Have you seen this woman? Last seen at Westlake Regional. Please, any information. The hospital refused to comment, citing privacy laws. Elaine hired a lawyer she couldn't afford, who explained that without evidence of wrongdoing, there was nothing to investigate. Naomi had presumably left of her own accord. Case closed. But Elaine couldn't close it. Couldn't stop calling the hospital. Couldn't stop checking Naomi's phone, which eventually got disconnected for non-payment. Couldn't stop imagining all the terrible possibilities. Naomi relapsing. Naomi hurt. Naomi dead somewhere, and no one knowing to connect the body to the missing person report. A year passed. Elaine celebrated Naomi's birthday alone, lighting a candle on a cupcake and sitting at her kitchen table crying. She'd retraced every step, called every contact, exhausted every lead. Naomi had simply vanished. Then, on an ordinary Thursday, Elaine received a call from the county coroner's office. They'd found a match for her daughter in their system. A death certificate had been issued. 11 months ago. Elaine couldn't breathe. Where was she found? Ma'am, she wasn't found. She was at Westlake Regional. The words didn't make sense. Elaine had been to Westlake. Had searched for Naomi. Had been told she left. The coroner's office employee sounded uncomfortable. There was a mix-up with identification. Your daughter never left the hospital. She died there approximately 36 hours after admission. The body was transferred to county morgue storage because no next of kin could be located. Elaine's vision blurred. I was there. I visited her. I called. I filed reports. Yes, ma'am. It appears there were significant administrative errors. The hospital is conducting an internal review. An internal review. As if that phrase could resurrect her daughter. As if it could return the year Elaine spent searching for someone who'd been dead the entire time. Stored in a freezer with a misspelled name on a tag. Naomi had died alone in a hospital room while Elaine was at home sleeping. Believing her daughter was stable. Believing the nurse who'd said Naomi left voluntarily. Believing a system that confused negligence with protocol. The hospital eventually issued a statement. Errors were made. Policies would be reviewed. Families would be notified more effectively in the future. The language was careful, crafted by lawyers to acknowledge fault without accepting liability. No one was fired. No one was charged. The system that had lost Naomi Bell continued functioning exactly as it had before. Elaine buried her daughter in a ceremony that should have happened a year earlier. Friends came. A few people from Naomi's past. But mostly it was small and quiet and unbearably sad. The grief was complicated by rage. At the hospital. At herself for believing them. At a world that could misplace a human being like a piece of lost luggage. After the funeral, Elaine couldn't sleep in her house. Every room reminded her of the year she'd spent hoping. The phone she'd kept charged in case Naomi called. The extra blanket she'd kept ready in case Naomi came home. The hope itself felt like a betrayal now. A foolish thing she'd clung to while her daughter's body cooled in storage. She started driving at night, unable to stay still. Past the hospital where Naomi had died and been erased. Past the bus stop where she'd collapsed. Past all the places that had once been part of her daughter's life, and were now just locations that meant nothing to anyone except Elaine. One night, she parked outside the hospital and watched people enter and exit. Ambulances arriving with emergencies. Families visiting. Staff changing shifts. The machine of healthcare grinding forward, indifferent to the individual stories being processed within its walls. A security guard eventually approached her car, asked if she was okay, if she needed help. Elaine wanted to laugh at the question. What help was there for a woman whose daughter had been lost by the very institution claiming to help her? Instead, she drove away and didn't go back. Across the country, in a small town that looked like 1,000 other small towns, a man named Noah Klein was discovering that loneliness makes people vulnerable in ways they don't recognize until it's too late. He worked night shifts at a distribution center, loading trucks in the dark hours when the rest of the world slept. It was solitary work, quiet except for the beep of forklifts and the rustle of cardboard. Noah didn't mind the solitude. He'd always been someone who felt more comfortable in his own company than in crowds. After work, he'd drive through empty streets, windows down, listening to music that was too old to be on the radio anymore. Sometimes he'd stop at a 24-hour diner and eat pancakes while reading paperback sci-fi novels he bought from thrift stores. The waitresses knew him by name, but not by story, which was exactly how he preferred it. He lived alone in a rental house that needed repairs he kept meaning to make. The porch sagged slightly. The bathroom faucet dripped. The screen door didn't close properly. But the rent was cheap and the landlord didn't bother him, and Noah had learned that sometimes good enough was actually good enough. The dating app had been a co-worker's suggestion. You're 25, man. You can't just work and read books forever. Noah had laughed it off, but downloaded the app anyway, more out of curiosity than genuine interest. He swiped through profiles without much attention, half-heartedly messaging a few people who never responded or responded once, and then disappeared. Then he matched with Brielle Vaughn. Her profile said she liked old movies and long drives in solitude. 3 things Noah understood. Her photos showed someone with an easy smile, dark hair, eyes that seemed to actually look at the camera instead of past it. She messaged first. I saw you like Bradbury. What's your favorite? They talked for weeks before meeting. Long conversations that stretched past midnight. She seemed to understand the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people, but feeling fundamentally separate from them. She texted the way Noah thought, in complete sentences, with actual punctuation. She remembered details he'd mentioned days earlier. What his favorite constellation was. That he preferred driving to flying. That he'd wanted to be an astronomer before he'd learned how much math was involved. When they finally decided to meet in person, Noah felt nervous in a way he hadn't expected. He changed shirts 3 times. Showed up 15 minutes early to the coffee shop they'd agreed on. Checked his phone compulsively in case she'd changed her mind. But Brielle appeared exactly when she said she would, wearing a blue jacket and the same easy smile from her photos. They talked for 3 hours. Coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into a walk through a park neither of them had been to before. The conversation flowed the same way it had over text, comfortable and effortless, 2 people who'd somehow found the same frequency. I'd like to see you again, Noah said as they stood by her car. Tomorrow, Brielle asked. They saw each other the next day, and the day after that. Within 2 weeks, it felt like they'd known each other for years. Brielle understood Noah's need for quiet. She didn't push him to go to parties or meet groups of friends. She seemed content to exist in the same spaces he preferred. Diners at odd hours. Long drives to nowhere specific. His living room with the sagging couch and the lamp that flickered when the wind blew. Noah started thinking about futures he'd stopped letting himself imagine. Maybe getting the porch fixed. Maybe planning a trip somewhere Brielle had mentioned wanting to go. Maybe not being alone anymore in the specific way that had defined his entire adult life. One evening, Brielle mentioned that her car was having issues. I think it's the transmission, she said, frustrated. I can't afford to fix it right now. You can borrow my truck, Noah offered immediately. I mostly just drive to work anyway. Brielle looked at him with something that might have been gratitude or might have been something else entirely. Are you sure? Of course. What's mine is yours. He said it casually, the way people in new relationships say things they mean in the moment without thinking about all the ways those words could be interpreted. She borrowed the truck the next day, returned it with a full tank of gas and a thank you text that made Noah smile. Then she borrowed it again a few days later, and again, until borrowing became an assumption, and Noah found himself catching rides to work from a coworker who asked too many questions about why his girlfriend needed his truck so often. She's looking for a new job, Noah explained. Needs reliable transportation for interviews. The coworker nodded but didn't look convinced. You trust her with it? Of course, Noah said, feeling defensive. Why wouldn't I? But small things started feeling strange. Brielle's stories about where she'd been didn't quite match the mileage on his truck. She'd mentioned going to an interview across town, but the odometer showed she'd driven 100 miles. When Noah asked about it, she'd laugh it off. Oh, I took the scenic route. Needed to clear my head. Reasonable. Understandable. Except it kept happening, and Brielle started being less available. Text responses came slower. Plans got canceled last minute. When they did see each other, she seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly, offering explanations that were just vague enough to be impossible to verify. Noah's co-worker pulled him aside one night during break. I saw your truck yesterday. Downtown. Brielle wasn't alone. Noah felt something cold settle in his stomach. What do you mean? There was a guy in the passenger seat. Looked pretty comfortable there. Noah wanted to dismiss it. His co-worker had probably seen someone else's truck. Probably mistaken the person in the passenger seat. But the doubt was there now. A small seed that started growing every time Brielle gave another vague answer about where she'd been. He decided to talk to her directly. Communication, honesty, all the things people say relationships need. He texted asking if they could meet. Got a response hours later. Can't tonight. Something came up. Tomorrow? Tomorrow came and Brielle canceled again. And the day after. A week passed and Noah realized he hadn't actually seen her in person, just received texts that could have been sent from anywhere. Finally, he called instead of texting. Brielle answered on the fourth ring, sounding out of breath. Hey, what's up? I miss you, Noah said, trying to keep his voice light. Feels like it's been forever. I know, I'm sorry. Work's been insane. But I'll come by this weekend, I promise. Except the weekend came and went and Brielle didn't show. Noah tried calling again. No answer. He texted. Read receipt, but no response. He drove to the address she'd given him when they first started dating, an apartment complex on the south side. But the unit number she'd specified didn't exist. The building only went up to Unit 12, and she'd said she lived in Unit 15. Noah sat in his co-worker's car in the parking lot, staring at the building directory, feeling stupid. All the small inconsistencies he'd ignored because he'd wanted so badly for this to be real. The vague addresses. The reluctance to introduce him to friends or family. The way she'd somehow never been available when it would have been natural to be available. He reported his truck stolen. The police took the report with the kind of weary efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first case of someone lending a vehicle to the wrong person. They asked for Brielle's information. Noah provided everything he had. Phone number, probably fake. Address, definitely fake. Photos from her dating profile, which might not even be her. We'll keep an eye out, the officer said, handing Noah a case number. But if she has the keys and you gave her permission to use it, legally it's complicated. 3 days later, police found the truck in a grocery store parking lot 2 counties over. Brielle was sitting in the driver's seat, engine off, eating fast food like she had every right to be there. She seemed surprised when officers approached. Confused even, like she couldn't understand why anyone would have a problem with her borrowing her boyfriend's truck. She had a story ready. Noah had given her the truck. They'd had an understanding. She was just running errands. Everything was fine between them. When police mentioned that Noah had reported the vehicle stolen, Brielle's expression shifted to hurt. He's just mad because we had a fight. This is him being petty. But there were inconsistencies the officers noticed immediately. The truck's registration showed Noah as the sole owner. Brielle had no documentation proving any agreement. And when they searched the vehicle, they found items that didn't belong to Noah. Men's clothes in a size he didn't wear. A wallet containing someone else's ID. Receipts from places Noah had never been. Brielle's story changed. The truck had been a gift. No, alone. No, they'd been sharing it. The confusion seemed genuine, like she couldn't quite remember which version she'd told to whom. They arrested her on vehicle theft charges. During processing, she gave 3 different addresses, 2 different birth dates, and 4 different versions of how she'd met Noah. The officer handling her case had seen this before. People who lied so reflexively that truth became just another variable to manipulate. Noah was contacted to retrieve his truck. When he arrived at the impound lot, he walked around the vehicle slowly, noting all the small violations. Fast food wrappers stuffed in the door pockets. A crack in the windshield that hadn't been there before. The smell of cigarettes, even though Brielle had claimed she didn't smoke. But it was the items in the truck bed that made his stomach turn. A shovel. A tarp. Zip ties still in their packaging. Things that individually meant nothing, but together suggested purposes Noah didn't want to imagine. The officer supervising the release noticed Noah's expression. "You okay?" Noah couldn't articulate what he was feeling. Relief that the truck was found. Confusion about what Brielle had actually wanted. Shame that he'd been so easily manipulated. And underneath all of it, a creeping horror about what might have happened if things had continued. If he'd trusted more. If he'd been more isolated. If circumstances had aligned differently. Did she say what she needed the truck for? Noah asked. The officer hesitated. "You might want to talk to Detective Morris. There are some questions about your girlfriend's activities." "She's not my girlfriend," Noah said quickly. I thought she was, but I don't think she was ever really anything." Detective Morris was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a desk covered in file folders. She gestured for Noah to sit and pulled out a notebook. "Tell me about Brielle Vaughn." Noah told her everything. The dating app. The long conversations. How perfect it had all seemed. How quickly it had fallen apart once he'd started asking questions. As he spoke, Detective Morris took notes without commenting, her expression neutral. When Noah finished, she asked, "Did Brielle ever mention other men she was seeing?" "No." "What?" Detective Morris slid a photograph across the desk. A man, early 30s, smiling in what looked like a driver's license photo. "Do you recognize him?" Noah studied the face. "No." "Should I?" "His name is Marcus Webb. He went missing 3 weeks ago. Last seen leaving his apartment with a woman matching Brielle's description. She told his roommate they were going hiking." The room felt suddenly smaller. Noah looked from the photograph to Detective Morris. "You think Brielle had something to do with it?" "We're investigating several possibilities. Marcus's truck was found abandoned near a state park. Same make and model as yours, actually. We found some of his belongings in Brielle's possession when she was arrested." Noah's hands were shaking. "What happened to him?" "We don't know yet. But we'd like your permission to search your truck more thoroughly. See if there's anything that might help us locate Marcus." Noah agreed immediately. Over the next 2 days, forensic teams processed his truck. They found traces of blood in the truck bed. Not Noah's blood type. Not Brielle's. The DNA would take weeks to process, but the implication was clear enough that Noah stopped sleeping through the night. He kept thinking about the conversations he'd had with Brielle. How she'd mirrored everything he'd said. How she'd seemed to understand him perfectly. He realized now that she hadn't been understanding him. She'd been studying him. Learning what he wanted to hear so she could say it back to him. The whole relationship had been a performance, and he'd been too lonely to notice he was the only one believing in it. Detective Morris called him a week later. They'd found Marcus Webb's body in a ravine 40 miles from where his truck was abandoned. Cause of death was blunt force trauma. Evidence suggested he'd been killed elsewhere and dumped. The timeline matched up with when Brielle had borrowed Noah's truck for an entire weekend, claiming she needed to visit family. "We don't think she used your truck for the actual crime," Detective Morris explained. "But we believe she was scouting locations. Planning. Your truck gave her mobility she didn't have with her own vehicle, which had broken down weeks earlier." Noah felt sick. "So I helped her?" "You were a victim too, Mr. Klein. She manipulated you. That's what she does." But the distinction felt thin. Marcus Webb was dead. Noah's truck had been part of the infrastructure that enabled his murder, even if Noah hadn't known it. The guilt was irrational but persistent. He'd handed over his keys to a stranger because she'd made him feel less alone. That decision had ripple effects he'd never intended but couldn't escape. Brielle was charged with first-degree murder along with the vehicle theft. During her trial, prosecutors painted a picture of someone who'd spent years cycling through relationships, extracting what she needed from vulnerable men and disappearing when they became suspicious or less useful. Noah was called to testify. He sat in the witness box and described falling for someone who'd never existed, and the courtroom listened with a mixture of sympathy and judgment. The defense argued that there was no direct evidence linking Brielle to Marcus's death. The blood in Noah's truck could have come from anywhere. The timeline was circumstantial. Brielle herself seemed genuinely confused during testimony, claiming she barely knew Marcus, that they'd met once for coffee and she'd never seen him again. But then prosecutors introduced evidence from Brielle's phone. Searches for how long does it take a body to decompose in rural areas with no cell service. Text messages to a friend saying she'd solved her transportation problem. Photos of Marcus's truck taken weeks before he disappeared, suggesting premeditation. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Found her guilty. Sentenced her to life without parole. Noah sat in the gallery and felt nothing except empty. Justice was supposed to provide closure. Instead, it just confirmed that he'd been a tool in someone else's violent scheme. Marcus Webb was still dead. Noah was still the person who'd made it easier for his killer to move freely. After the trial, Noah sold his truck. Couldn't stand looking at it. Bought a small sedan and drove it only when absolutely necessary. He deleted all his dating apps. Stopped going to the diner where waitresses knew his name. Moved to a different town where no one recognized him from news coverage of the trial. But he couldn't move away from the memory of Brielle's smile. The way she'd looked at him like he mattered. The ease of their conversations. All of it was false, but it had felt so devastatingly real. And that was the part that haunted him. Not that he'd been fooled, but that he'd wanted so badly to believe in connection that he'd ignored every warning sign. On an island known for turquoise water and luxury resorts, a woman named Irina Volkova was learning that beauty could be a kind of camouflage for danger. She'd been traveling for 6 months, moving slowly through Southeast Asia and now into the Pacific, staying in hostels and budget hotels, documenting everything in journals she'd mail home to her sister in Moscow. Irina traveled alone by choice. She'd tried group tours and found them suffocating. Too many schedules. Too many compromises about where to eat or what to see. Alone, she could wake up and decide on impulse to take a ferry to a different island or spend an entire day reading in a hammock. Freedom felt like the whole point of traveling. Azure Coast Island was her 10th stop. Smaller than the tourist destinations, less developed, quieter. She'd rented a room in a guest house run by a local family. The mother cooked breakfast every morning. The father offered suggestions about which beaches to visit. Their daughter, maybe 8 years old, practiced English by asking Irina questions about Russia. "Is it cold all the time?" the girl asked one morning. "Only most of the time," Irina replied, smiling. "But we have beautiful summers. You should visit someday." The girl nodded seriously, as if already planning the trip in her mind. Irina felt a pang of homesickness watching her. She'd been gone long enough that familiar things felt distant. Her sister's voice on phone calls, the smell of her mother's kitchen, the specific quality of light in Moscow during late afternoon. But she pushed the feeling away. She had 3 more months of travel planned. Homesickness could wait. She'd been using a dating app casually, not for romance exactly, but for connection. It was strange being constantly surrounded by people whose language you spoke poorly and whose customs you only half understood. The app gave her access to conversations in English with locals who could recommend places tourists never found. She'd met a few people that way. Coffee with an Australian woman teaching English on the island. Lunch with a German backpacker passing through. Nothing romantic. Just human contact that eased the specific loneliness of solo travel. Arjun Patel's profile appeared one evening while Irina sat on her guest house balcony watching the sun set. His photos showed someone around her age, maybe early 30s. Dark hair, glasses, a smile that looked genuine rather than performed. His bio mentioned he was working remotely on the island, something in software development. Originally from Mumbai, but he'd been living in various countries for 5 years. He messaged first. "I saw you're from Moscow. I spent a month there last year. Beautiful city." They talked about Moscow, about travel, about the strange experience of being perpetually foreign, always the outsider trying to decode social rules everyone else absorbed as children. Arjun wrote in complete sentences with actual punctuation, which Irina appreciated. So many conversations on dating apps felt like reading telegrams. But Arjun seemed thoughtful, articulate, willing to engage with ideas rather than just exchange pleasantries. After 3 days of messaging, he suggested meeting for coffee. Irina agreed. They met at a cafe near the waterfront. Arjun looked like his photos, which was already a point in his favor. Too many people presented versions of themselves that bore little resemblance to reality. He was polite, asking questions, and actually listening to answers rather than waiting for his turn to talk. They spent 2 hours at the cafe, then walked along the beach. The conversation flowed easily. Arjun had traveled extensively. He understood the appeal of slow travel, of staying in places long enough to move past the tourist version and glimpse something more real. He talked about his work in a way that didn't bore Irina, which was rare. Most people discussing software development made it sound like the most tedious occupation possible. When they parted, Arjun asked if she'd like to meet again. There's a hiking trail on the north side of the island. Not many tourists know about it. Beautiful views. Irina hesitated. Meeting in a public cafe was one thing. Going on a remote hike with someone she'd just met was different. But Arjun seemed safe, intelligent, respectful, and she'd been traveling alone for 6 months without incident. She'd learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts said Arjun was exactly what he appeared to be. Sure, she said. That sounds nice. They planned it for 2 days later. Arjun offered to pick her up from her guest house. The trailhead is hard to find. Easier if I drive. The morning of the hike, Irina told the guest house owner where she was going. Left a note with Arjun's name and the hiking trail location. Basic safety precautions she'd learned from travel blogs and common sense. The owner's daughter waved goodbye from the kitchen window as Irina climbed into Arjun's car. The drive took 40 minutes. Arjun was chatty, pointing out landmarks. A local market worth visiting. A beach where sea turtles nested. A restaurant that made the best curry on the island. Normal conversation. Nothing that triggered alarm. But when they reached what should have been the trailhead, there was nothing. No marked path. No other cars. Just a dirt road leading into dense vegetation. Are you sure this is it? Irina asked. Arjun checked his phone. Yeah, the trail starts just up there. It's unmarked. That's why tourists don't find it. Irina felt the first flutter of unease. But she was already here. Already committed to the day. And Arjun was still being friendly, normal, showing no signs of anything concerning. She told herself she was being paranoid. Not every isolated location meant danger. She'd hiked alone in dozens of remote places without incident. They started walking. The path, if it could be called that, was barely visible. Overgrown. Clearly unused for some time. Arjun walked ahead, using his phone's GPS to navigate. Irina followed, pushing aside branches, watching her footing on the uneven ground. 20 minutes in, the vegetation became thicker. The canopy overhead blocked most of the sunlight. It felt less like hiking and more like bushwhacking. Irina stopped. Maybe we should go back. This doesn't seem like a real trail. Arjun turned to face her. His expression had changed. The friendly warmth was gone, replaced by something flat and cold. We're almost there. Almost where? There's nothing here. Keep walking, Irina. The use of her name, which had felt personal and friendly before, now sounded like a threat. Irina's heart started racing. She looked around, calculating distances. They were far from the road. Far from anyone who might hear her scream. She'd told the guest house owner where she was going, but she'd said North Side Hiking Trail, which could mean anywhere in a 10-mile radius. I want to go back, she said firmly. Arjun stepped closer. You're not going back. Irina ran. Not toward the path they'd come from, because Arjun was blocking that direction, but perpendicular into the vegetation. She heard him behind her, crashing through branches. Her travel backpack caught on thorns and slowed her down. She shrugged it off, abandoning it, focused only on creating distance. But the terrain was unfamiliar and treacherous. Her foot caught on a root. She stumbled, fell hard, pain shooting through her ankle. She tried to get up, but Arjun was already there, grabbing her arm, pulling her upright with a grip that would leave bruises. Don't make this harder, he said, and there was something almost disappointed in his voice, like she'd failed to cooperate with an expected script. Irina tried to fight, scratched at his face, kicked with her good leg, screamed even though she knew no one would hear. But Arjun was stronger and prepared in a way she wasn't. He'd planned this. Had probably planned it from the moment he'd swiped right on her profile. Maybe even before that, looking specifically for solo female travelers, vulnerable and trusting. The violence, when it came, was swift and brutal. Arjun didn't draw it out or explain himself. There was no monologue about why he was doing this. Just efficient, practiced movements that suggested this wasn't his first time. Irina's last coherent thought was about her sister. About the journals she'd been mailing home. about how her sister would read them and try to piece together what had happened. Looking for clues Irina hadn't known to leave because she'd trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. Back at the guest house, the owner's daughter asked when Irina would return. She said she'd be back for dinner, the mother replied. The hiking trail isn't far, but dinner came and went. The guest house family wasn't worried yet. Travelers kept irregular schedules. Maybe Irina had met friends. Maybe she'd decided to watch the sunset from somewhere scenic. They left a plate of food covered in the kitchen, just in case. Meanwhile, Arjun returned to his rental apartment and began the careful work of cleanup. He showered, changed clothes, bagged the hiking outfit he'd been wearing, and added it to trash he'd dispose of far from his residence. Then he picked up Irina's phone, which he'd taken from her backpack before abandoning it in the jungle. He'd watched her enter her passcode enough times during coffee to memorize it. People were careless with their devices, treating them like extensions of themselves rather than windows into their entire lives. He unlocked the phone and began composing messages. To Irina's sister in Moscow, having an amazing time. Met someone special. Going off-grid for a few days to explore. Don't worry about me. To a friend she'd been messaging regularly. Taking a break from my phone. Need to disconnect and just be present. Talk soon. To the guest house owner, he sent nothing. Irina hadn't exchanged numbers with them. She'd paid for a week up front and could easily disappear for days without raising immediate alarm. Arjun crafted each message carefully, mimicking Irina's writing style. She used proper punctuation. She often included emojis, but not excessively. She signed off with XX to close friends. He replicated these patterns, creating a digital ghost that would keep people from looking for Irina's body while he decided what to do with it. The messages worked exactly as intended. Irina's sister, Katya, read the text and felt happy rather than concerned. Irina had been traveling alone for months, and it was about time she met someone. Katya messaged back with heart emojis and encouragement. Be safe. Have fun. Send photos when you can. Photos. Arjun hadn't thought about that. People expected photos now. Proof of experiences. Evidence of the life being lived. He scrolled through Irina's camera roll, looking for recent images he could send. A sunset from 3 days ago. A plate of food from a restaurant. A selfie where Irina smiled at the camera, wind in her hair, ocean behind her. He sent the selfie to Katya with a message. Me being happy. 3 words that would buy him days, maybe weeks, before anyone started asking real questions. But Arjun had made mistakes. Small ones that individually meant nothing but together would eventually form a pattern. He'd used his real name on the dating app, too arrogant or too careless to create a fake identity. His rental apartment was registered under his actual passport. His car was rented through a legitimate agency, with all his information on file. He'd assumed, like many people who commit violence, that he was smarter than the systems designed to catch him. That careful planning in the moment of the crime would outweigh sloppiness in the preparation. He was wrong. 5 days after Irina disappeared, a local farmer found her backpack while checking his property lines. It was torn and dirty, but clearly expensive. The kind of thing travelers used. Inside were a passport, a wallet with credit cards, and a small notebook with an entry dated the day she vanished. Hiking with Arjun today. North Side Trail. Feeling good about this trip. The farmer brought the backpack to the police station. An officer logged it and began the process of trying to contact the owner. Irina's passport listed her sister as an emergency contact. When they called Katya in Moscow, she was confused. But I just heard from her yesterday. She said she was fine. When did you last speak to her? Voice or video? Katya thought about it. Maybe 4 days ago. We've been texting. We found her backpack abandoned. We need to verify she's safe. Katya's confusion turned to fear. She tried calling Irina's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. She sent urgent messages. Call me. Police found your backpack. I'm worried. The messages showed as delivered but not read. Katya contacted the Russian embassy. Filed a missing person report. Provided all the information she had. The last text from Irina. The hiking trail mentioned in the notebook. The name Arjun. The Azure Coast Island police weren't equipped for major investigations. They handled tourist disputes and petty theft, not potential homicides. But they took the report seriously and began looking for Arjun Patel. Finding him was easier than it should have been. He was still on the island, still in his rental apartment, still using his real identity. When police knocked on his door, he answered calmly, as if he'd been expecting them. "We're looking for information about Irina Volkova," the officer said. "We understand you knew her." "I met her once for coffee," Arjun said smoothly. "Nice woman." "What?" "She's been reported missing. Her family is concerned." "Missing?" Arjun's expression showed perfect surprise. "That's terrible. I hope she's okay." "When did you last see her?" "A week ago, maybe. We had coffee and talked about travel. That was it." "Did you make plans to see her again?" Arjun hesitated just long enough to be noticeable. "No, just the one meeting." The officer consulted his notes. "We found a journal entry where she mentioned going hiking with you. She must have been confused. Or maybe she meant someone else named Arjun." But the officer was watching Arjun's body language now. The way his hands moved to his pockets. The way his eyes shifted slightly left when he spoke. Small tells that suggested discomfort. "Would you mind if we looked at your car? Do you have a warrant? We can get one. Or you can consent to a search and help us find this missing woman." Arjun calculated. Refusing would make him look guilty. Consenting might too, if they found anything. But he'd cleaned the car. Had been meticulous about it. "Fine. Go ahead." The search took 20 minutes. Officers found nothing in the passenger compartment. But in the trunk, beneath the spare tire, they discovered a small amount of blood. Fresh enough that it hadn't fully dried. When they asked Arjun about it, his story changed again. "I cut myself changing the tire last week. Must be from that." "You changed the tire but the spare is still here and used?" Arjun's confidence began cracking. "I fixed the original tire. Didn't need the spare." "But you bled into the trunk while changing a tire you didn't actually change." The logic collapsed under minimal pressure. Arjun requested a lawyer. Police arrested him on suspicion of involvement in Irina's disappearance. While he sat in a cell, officers organized a search of the area where the backpack was found. It took them 2 days. The terrain was difficult, vegetation thick. But eventually a search dog indicated a disturbed area about half a mile from where the backpack had been discovered. The grave was shallow, hurried. Irina's body was wrapped in a tarp, barely covered with dirt and leaves. The autopsy revealed what everyone already suspected. Blunt force trauma, strangulation, defensive wounds on her hands where she'd fought back. Time of death consistent with the day she'd gone hiking with Arjun. Everything pointed to a premeditated attack that had somehow still been sloppy enough to leave evidence everywhere. During interrogation, Arjun's lawyer advised him not to speak. But Arjun seemed compelled to explain himself, as if the right words could make people understand that what he'd done wasn't really his fault. He talked about how Irina had led him on, how she'd agreed to go hiking alone with him, which meant she wanted something to happen, how women traveling alone were asking for attention, for danger, for whatever consequences found them. The interrogating officer listened without expression. When Arjun finished, she asked, "So you're saying Irina Volkova is responsible for her own murder?" "I'm saying she made choices that put her in a vulnerable position. And you made the choice to kill her." Arjun didn't answer. His lawyer ended the interview. But the confession, partial and twisted as it was, had been recorded. Combined with the physical evidence and the digital trail of messages he'd sent from Irina's phone, the case was overwhelming. The trial was swift. Azure Coast Island wanted the case resolved quickly, partly for justice and partly because international attention was bad for tourism. Katia flew from Moscow to attend. She sat in the courtroom every day, staring at Arjun with an expression that mixed grief and rage and incomprehension. Prosecutors presented the evidence methodically. The dating app messages showing Arjun's escalating interest. The journal entry proving they'd planned to hike together. The abandoned backpack. The blood in his car. The body in the shallow grave. The fake messages sent from Irina's phone to delay discovery. Arjun's defense tried to argue reasonable doubt. Maybe someone else had killed Irina. Maybe Arjun had found the body and panicked. Maybe the evidence was circumstantial. But the story they constructed was too full of holes. Too many coincidences required to make Arjun innocent. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Found him guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. Katia felt nothing watching him be led away in handcuffs. She'd expected satisfaction or closure or something that resembled resolution. Instead, she just felt hollow. After the trial, she stayed on the island for a week, retracing Irina's final days. She visited the guest house where Irina had stayed. The owner's daughter, now understanding what had happened, cried and apologized even though she had nothing to apologize for. Katia sat on the balcony where Irina had watched sunsets and tried to imagine her sister's last happy moments before she'd climbed into Arjun's car. She went to the cafe where they'd met for coffee, ordered what Irina usually ordered, tea with milk and too much sugar. She walked the beach where they'd strolled after their first meeting, before Arjun had revealed what he really was. Every location felt haunted by the ghost of her sister's trust, by the version of reality Irina had believed in until it was too late. The hardest visit was to the place where Irina's body had been found. Police had long since processed the scene and returned the area to its natural state. Katia stood at the edge of the jungle, looking at vegetation that had concealed her sister's grave, and felt rage at how indifferent nature was. The trees didn't care. The soil didn't remember. Everything just continued existing as if Irina had never been there at all. She collected some soil in a small container. It felt important to bring something of this place back to Moscow, to the grave where Irina's body would eventually rest. A connection between where she died and where she'd be mourned. On the flight home, Katia read through Irina's journals one more time. Her sister had been happy during her travels. Fulfilled. The entries were full of small observations about people she'd met and places she'd seen. There was no fear, no premonition of danger. Just a young woman experiencing the world with openness and curiosity. The last entry was dated the morning of the hike. Arjun seems kind, intelligent, the sort of person I'd want as a friend even after I leave the island. It's nice to connect with someone who understands what it's like to be permanently traveling. Most people don't get it. Katia closed the journal and stared out the airplane window at clouds that looked like continents. Her sister had died because she'd believed in human goodness. Because she'd trusted that someone who seemed kind actually was kind. That wasn't naivety. That was hope. And the world had punished her for it. Back in Pine Hollow, years had passed since Ethan Rowe disappeared. His children were teenagers now. The older one, his daughter, had learned to live with the absence of a father who'd vanished without explanation. The younger one, his son, barely remembered Ethan except through photographs and stories that felt more like legends than memories. Mara had built a new life. The patio in the backyard had become the center of her social world. She hosted barbecues, book club meetings, casual gatherings where neighbors drank wine and complained about property taxes and school board politics. The concrete slab that David had noticed years ago was now adorned with potted plants and string lights. It looked permanent, settled, like it had always been part of the landscape. But David hadn't forgotten. He'd continued collecting small pieces of information. Strange financial transactions in Ethan's accounts after he'd supposedly left. The fact that Ethan's work pension had been redirected to Mara without proper documentation of his consent. The way Mara's stories about Ethan's departure shifted slightly each time she told them. Small variations that suggested improvisation rather than memory. He'd compiled everything into a folder he kept in his desk drawer. Bank statements, screenshots of text messages, notes from conversations with Ethan's brother. It wasn't enough for police to act on. Just suspicions and inconsistencies that proved nothing except that David couldn't let go. Then one afternoon, David received a call from Ethan's daughter. She was 16 now. Her voice on the phone was shaky. "Mr. Chun, I need to talk to someone about my dad." They met at a coffee shop across town, far from where Mara might see them. Ethan's daughter, whose name was Sophie, looked like a younger female version of her father. Same serious expression. Same careful way of choosing words. "I don't think my dad left," she said quietly. "I think something happened to him." David had waited years to hear someone else say this. "What makes you think that?" Sophie pulled out her phone and showed him a video. It was dated from 5 years ago, recorded on a cheap camera in what looked like Ethan's house. The footage was shaky, clearly filmed by a child trying to be secretive. "I used to hide cameras around the house," Sophie explained. "Kid stuff, pretending I was a spy. I forgot about most of them. But I found this one last month when I was cleaning out old storage boxes." David watched the video. It showed Mara and Ethan arguing in the kitchen. The audio was muffled, but he could make out some words. Ethan saying, "I want a divorce." Mara responding with something David couldn't hear. Then Ethan, "I'm taking the kids. You can keep the house, keep everything. I just want them safe." The video cut off there. but it was dated 2 days before Ethan supposedly left for the machinery exhibition and never returned. "Have you shown this to anyone?" David asked. "No. I'm scared. My mom." Sophie's voice broke. "I don't want to believe she could do something, but I keep thinking about that weekend. I was at my grandmother's house with my brother. When we came home, Dad was gone and Mom said he'd left us. But he'd never leave us. He told me that all the time. I'll never leave you." David felt the weight of years of suspicion finally solidifying into something actionable. "We need to take this to the police. What if I'm wrong? What if there's an explanation? Then the police will find it. But Sophie, if you're right." She nodded, understanding. If she was right, then she'd been living with her father's killer for 5 years, eating meals prepared by hands that had ended his life, accepting comfort from someone who'd stolen her father from her. They went to the police station together. The detective who took their statement listened carefully, watching the video multiple times. "This doesn't prove a crime occurred," he said carefully, "but it does establish motive and timeline. Combined with the missing person report and the suspicious circumstances, it's enough to warrant further investigation." The investigation moved slowly. Police requested access to the property to search for evidence. Mara's lawyer fought the request, claiming harassment. Months passed in legal battles. David and Sophie waited, suspended between hope and dread. Finally, a judge granted the warrant. On a cold morning in November, excavation equipment arrived at Ethan's old house. Mara stood in the doorway watching, her face expressionless, as workers began breaking up the concrete patio she'd installed years earlier. The digging took hours. Neighbors gathered on the street, phones out, recording everything. News vans arrived. The story had spread quickly through Pine Hollow. Missing man's body possibly buried in own backyard. Wife suspected. Children now teenagers. The kind of tragedy that feels impossible until it's happening right in front of you. David stood beside Sophie, one hand on her shoulder. She was shaking despite the warmth of the afternoon. Her younger brother was at school, protected from this moment for a few more hours. Someone from victim services stood nearby, ready to provide support if the excavation confirmed what everyone now suspected. At 2:47 p.m., one of the workers signaled to the detective. They'd found something. Human remains, wrapped in plastic, buried approximately 4 feet below the concrete slab. The depth suggested planning. Someone had dug carefully, taken time, ensured the grave would be deep enough that casual construction work wouldn't disturb it. Sophie made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. David pulled her away from the scene, toward a patrol car where she could sit down. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, inadequate words for a moment that had no adequate words. Mara was arrested that evening. She said nothing, invoked her right to an attorney, and was processed with the mechanical efficiency of the criminal justice system. Bail was denied. She sat in a cell and stared at walls that reflected nothing back at her. The remains were identified through dental records as Ethan Rowe. Cause of death was a gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet was still in the body, preserved by the plastic wrapping and the years underground. Forensic analysis would eventually match it to a gun registered in Mara's name, purchased 3 months before Ethan disappeared. The trial became a media spectacle. Court TV covered it. True crime podcasters dissected every detail. Online communities debated evidence and motive, and whether Mara had acted alone or had help. The story had everything people craved in their entertainment. Murder, deception, a body buried in plain sight while life continued normally above it. Prosecutors built their case methodically. They presented the video Sophie had found, showing Ethan threatening divorce. They showed financial records proving Mara had accessed Ethan's accounts after his death, transferring funds, maintaining the illusion that he was alive somewhere. They presented phone records showing text messages sent from Ethan's device after his death, all from locations near Mara's home. Expert witnesses testified about the concrete slab. Its installation had been rushed, completed in a weekend by Mara herself with help from a contractor who remembered her being insistent about doing the work immediately. The contractor testified that Mara had already dug the area before he arrived, claiming she wanted to install drainage pipes. He'd simply poured concrete over her prep work. The defense's strategy was unexpected. They argued that Sophie had killed her father, that the shooting was accidental, that Mara had covered it up to protect her daughter. They called Sophie to the stand. put a 16-year-old girl in front of a courtroom and asked her to explain what happened the night her father died. Sophie, pale and trembling, told a story her lawyer had clearly prepared her to tell. She said she'd found her parents fighting, said her father had a gun, said she'd tried to take it from him and it had fired accidentally, said her mother had panicked and made her promise never to tell anyone, said they'd buried him together, a mother and daughter united in terrible secret. The courtroom was silent listening to this. Some people cried. Others looked skeptical. David, sitting in the gallery, felt sick. He knew Sophie, knew she was lying, but he understood why. Mara's lawyers had convinced her that this was the only way to save her mother, that taking responsibility would result in juvenile charges at worst, that family loyalty meant protecting each other no matter what. But the prosecution tore the story apart. They presented timeline evidence. Sophie had been at her grandmother's house the weekend Ethan died. Her grandmother testified to this. Phone records confirmed it. There were photographs from that weekend showing Sophie at a birthday party 60 miles away while her father was being killed and buried. They presented forensic evidence. The angle of the gunshot wound was inconsistent with an accidental discharge during a struggle. It was a deliberate shot, fired from several feet away, aimed with intention. They presented psychological evaluations. Sophie showed signs of coaching. Her story had inconsistencies that suggested memorization rather than actual memory. She couldn't answer basic questions about details that someone who'd lived through the experience would know instinctively. The defense's strategy collapsed. The jury saw it for what it was: a desperate attempt to use a child as a shield, to exploit Sophie's love for her mother by convincing her to lie under oath. Mara's lawyer tried to salvage the case by arguing self-defense, that Ethan had been abusive, that Mara had feared for her life. But there was no evidence of abuse. Friends, family, co-workers all testified that Ethan had been gentle, devoted, conflict-averse. The only person claiming he was violent was Mara, and her credibility was destroyed by the fact that she'd lied about everything else. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found Mara guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life without possibility of parole. As she was led away, Mara looked at Sophie one time. Her expression was difficult to read. Regret, maybe, or anger at being caught, or nothing at all. Sophie and her brother became wards of Ethan's brother in Nevada. They left Pine Hollow and the house where their father was buried and the school where everyone knew their story, starting over in a place where people might let them be anonymous. David visited Sophie once after the trial. She was living in a small town outside Las Vegas, attending a new high school, trying to build a life that wasn't defined by tragedy. "Do you think she loved him?" Sophie asked. "My dad, I mean. Do you think she ever loved him?" David considered lying, offering comfort. But Sophie deserved honesty. "I don't know. Maybe at some point. But love doesn't murder someone and bury them in the backyard." Whatever she felt, it wasn't love. Sophie nodded. "I keep having this dream where he's alive, where the whole thing was a mistake, and he comes home, and everything is normal again. Then I wake up and remember what's real. That's grief," David said gently. "It plays tricks, makes you bargain with reality. How long does it last? I don't know. Maybe forever. Maybe you just learn to carry it differently." After David left, Sophie sat on the porch of her uncle's house and watched traffic pass. Cars full of people living normal lives, unaware of the weight she carried. Her father was dead. Her mother was in prison. She'd been manipulated into lying in court, into claiming responsibility for a murder she hadn't committed. And she had to find a way to live with all of it. In Red Clay County, Lucia Moreno's case finally broke open 3 years after she disappeared. A hiker found remains in a wooded area 12 miles from the apartment where she'd lived with Caleb. Animals had scattered the bones. Weather had degraded everything. But dental records confirmed the identity. Caleb was arrested and charged with murder. His trial followed the same pattern as Mara's. Prosecutors presented evidence of domestic violence. Neighbors testified about the fights they'd heard. Lucia's friends talked about how she'd changed after marrying him, how she'd become quieter, more isolated, more afraid. The defense argued that Lucia had run away and died by misadventure, that Caleb had nothing to do with her death. But forensic evidence told a different story. The positioning of the remains suggested the body had been placed there, not that someone had died there naturally. Fabric fragments matched clothing from Lucia's closet. and there were injuries to the bones consistent with blunt force trauma that had occurred before death. Most damning was Caleb's behavior after Lucia disappeared. He'd cleaned the apartment obsessively in the days following her vanishing. Replaced carpet, painted walls, thrown away furniture. When police finally searched the property years later, luminol testing revealed blood evidence despite the cleaning. Lucia's blood in the bedroom, in the hallway, patterns suggesting she tried to run and been caught. The jury convicted him. Life sentence. Another murderer behind bars. Another family left to grieve not just the loss but the years of uncertainty, the time spent hoping while knowing hope was probably foolish. Lucia's grandmother died before the trial concluded. She never got closure. Never learned what happened to the granddaughter who'd sent money every month, who'd worked 2 jobs to afford medication, who'd been killed by the man who'd promised to love her. Maria, Lucia's friend from the diner, attended every day of the trial. She sat in the same seat, directly behind the prosecution, where Caleb would have to see her if he turned around. She wanted him to see her. Wanted him to know that Lucia had people who cared, who remembered, who wouldn't let her disappear into statistics. After the verdict, Maria stood outside the courthouse and spoke to reporters. Lucia was working toward something. She had plans. She was going to finish her bookkeeping certification and help her grandmother and build a real life. And he took all of that away because he couldn't stand the idea of her being independent. The reporter asked if Maria felt justice had been served. Justice would be Lucia alive, Maria said. This is just punishment. It's not the same thing. She was right. The distinction mattered. Courts could punish. They could remove dangerous people from society. They could validate that a wrong had occurred. But they couldn't restore what was lost. Couldn't give Lucia back her future. Couldn't undo the fear of her final moments. Maria eventually left the diner. The job held too many memories. Every time she poured coffee, she thought about Lucia's section, the tables she used to serve, the way she'd memorized regular customers' orders. The absence was everywhere. In the schedule that no longer needed her name. In the locker that had been cleared out. In the tips jar they'd once shared. She moved to a different city. Got a different job. Tried to build a life that wasn't haunted by her friend's ghost. But sometimes, late at night, she'd remember Lucia laughing at some customer's terrible joke or talking about her plans for the future. The memory was precious and painful in equal measure. In the years following these cases, patterns emerged. Researchers studying intimate partner violence looked at the factors that had been present in Lucia's relationship with Caleb. The isolation, the control, the escalation from verbal abuse to physical violence. They found the same patterns repeated across thousands of cases. Different names, different cities, but the same story told over and over. Advocacy groups used these cases to push for better training for police responding to domestic violence calls. The officers who'd visited Lucia's apartment twice and done nothing became examples in training seminars. What would you have done differently? Instructors asked. What signs did they miss? But knowing the signs and stopping the violence were different things. The system was reactive, not proactive. It responded to crimes after they occurred. It couldn't prevent them. Couldn't reach into troubled relationships and extract victims before violence turned lethal. Elaine Bell never recovered from learning her daughter had died in the hospital while she searched for her. The betrayal of it consumed her. She'd trusted the hospital. Had believed them when they said Naomi left voluntarily. Had wasted a year hoping for a reunion that was already impossible. She sued Westlake Regional Medical Center. The case dragged through courts for years. Hospital lawyers argued that mistakes happen, that the staff had been overworked and understaffed, that no single person was responsible. They offered a settlement, money in exchange for silence, an NDA that would prevent Elaine from speaking publicly about what happened. Elaine refused. I don't want their money. I want them to admit what they did. But admissions of guilt expose institutions to liability. The hospital would never admit fault in a way that mattered. Their lawyers crafted careful statements acknowledging procedural failures and communication breakdowns without accepting direct responsibility for Naomi's death. Eventually, Elaine accepted a settlement, not because she wanted to, but because fighting had exhausted her financially and emotionally. The money meant nothing. She donated most of it to organizations serving homeless populations and people struggling with addiction. The people the system failed the same way it had failed her daughter. She spent her remaining years volunteering at a shelter, serving meals to people who looked like Naomi might have looked during her worst periods. Hollow-eyed, weathered, invisible to most of society. She learned their names, listened to their stories, treated them like human beings who mattered. "You remind me of my daughter," she told one young woman who came in regularly. "Is she here?" the woman asked, looking around. "No," Elaine said. "She died." "I'm sorry." "Me too." These small interactions became Elaine's way of honoring Naomi. Every person she helped was a small rebellion against the systems that treated vulnerable people as disposable. Every meal served was a rejection of the hospital's negligence. Every name remembered was proof that people mattered even when institutions forgot them. She died 5 years after Naomi, quietly in her sleep. Friends who cleaned out her apartment found boxes of Naomi's belongings carefully preserved. Childhood photos, report cards, the last birthday card Naomi had given her before addiction took over. Evidence of a life that had mattered to at least one person, even if the world had been ready to forget it. Noah Klein never returned to dating. The experience with Brielle had broken something in him. Not just trust in others, but trust in his own judgment. He believed her so completely, had ignored red flags that seemed obvious in retrospect. The shame of that was worse than the betrayal. He moved to a small town in Montana where no one knew his story. Got a job at a ski resort maintaining equipment. Lived alone in a cabin without internet, without social media, without any of the technology that had connected him to Brielle. His co-workers thought he was reclusive, antisocial. They didn't push. Mountain towns attracted people running from something. Everyone had their reasons for choosing isolation. Sometimes tourists would ask Noah for recommendations. Where to eat? What trails to hike? He'd answer briefly and return to his work. He couldn't help noticing when solo travelers asked these questions. Young people far from home, trusting strangers because loneliness made trust feel necessary. He wanted to warn them, to say, be careful who you trust. People aren't always what they seem. But the words felt too heavy. Too much explanation required. So he'd just say stay on marked trails, and hope they understood he meant more than directions. Marcus Webb's parents never fully accepted what happened to their son. The randomness of it was unbearable. He'd swiped right on a dating app, made a simple decision that millions of people made every day, and it had cost him his life. They attended Brielle's trial, but found no comfort in the proceedings. Watching her sit emotionless while prosecutors described how she'd killed their son felt surreal. Like watching a play about someone else's tragedy. When the guilty verdict came, Marcus's mother didn't react. Just sat there staring at nothing. After the trial, they sold Marcus's truck. Couldn't bear to see it or drive it, or remember him loading groceries into the bed or washing it on Saturday mornings. A stranger bought it, drove away. The truck continued existing in the world while Marcus didn't. They tried grief counseling, joined a support group for parents who'd lost children to violence, listened to other people's stories, and recognized the same themes. The randomness, the what-ifs, the desperate searching for meaning in events that had no meaning beyond cruelty and opportunity intersecting at the wrong moment. Does it get easier? Marcus's father asked the group leader. It gets different, she said. You learn to carry it. But it's always there. Years later, they could talk about Marcus without crying every time. Could look at his photos without feeling like the grief would physically crush them. Could function in the world even though part of them had died with their son. This was healing, apparently. Learning to live with permanent damage. Katia tried to continue traveling after Irina's death. She felt she owed it to her sister. To not let fear win. To keep experiencing the world the way Irina had loved experiencing it. But everywhere she went, she saw danger. Every friendly stranger was potentially violent. Every invitation to explore was potentially a trap. She made it 3 months before giving up. Returned to Moscow. Got an office job. Lived a quiet life that Irina would have found boring. But boring felt safe. Predictable. No one could hurt you if you never trusted them enough to get close. She kept Irina's journals in a locked drawer. Sometimes she'd take them out and read entries at random. Her sister's handwriting was enthusiastic, loops and flourishes that suggested someone who approached life with energy. The contrast between the hopeful words on the page and the knowledge of how the story ended made the journals almost unbearable to read. One entry, dated 3 weeks before Irina died, described a sunset she'd watched from a beach. The sky turned colors I've never seen before. Pink and orange and this shade of purple that doesn't exist in Moscow. I felt so small in the best way. Like my problems didn't matter because the universe was so much bigger than me. I want to feel this way forever. Katia closed the journal and put it back in the drawer. Irina had felt small in a way that brought peace. Now she was small in a way that meant gone. Reduced to remains in a grave. A name on a headstone. Memories that would fade as people who knew her died. On the anniversary of Irina's death, Katia flew back to Azure Coast Island. She visited the grave where her sister's body had been found. Someone had placed flowers there. She never learned who. Maybe other travelers who'd heard the story. Maybe locals who felt guilty that violence had happened in their paradise. She sat on the ground and talked to the air. Told Irina about work. About their parents aging. About the cat that still waited by the door some evenings as if expecting Irina to come home. One-sided conversations that felt necessary even though they changed nothing. "I'm angry at you sometimes," Katia said out loud. For trusting him. For going into that car. For not seeing what he was. Then immediately felt guilty for blaming her sister for her own murder. But grief was complicated. It held contradictions. She could simultaneously miss Irina desperately and be furious at the choices that led to her death. Both feelings were real. Both were valid. Before leaving the island, Katia visited the guest house where Irina had stayed. The family remembered her. The daughter was a teenager now. She brought out a drawing she'd made years ago. A stick figure with long hair labeled Irina, standing next to a stick figure labeled me. "She was nice to me," the girl said. "I drew this the day before she went hiking. I was going to give it to her when she came back." Katia took the drawing, added it to the collection of Irina's belongings she kept like religious relics. Every object that had touched her sister's life became sacred. Proof that she'd existed. That she'd mattered to people beyond just family. The flight back to Moscow felt longer than it should have. Katia watched clouds through the window and thought about all the people currently traveling alone. Trusting strangers. Believing in human goodness. Some would be fine. Most would be fine. But some wouldn't. And there was no way to know which until it was too late. Back in Pine Hollow, Sophie was learning to live with being the girl whose mother killed her father. She'd changed schools, but the story followed her. Someone always knew. Would whisper to friends. Point her out in hallways. Reduce her entire existence to the worst thing that had ever happened to her family. Her brother dealt with it differently. He was younger when it happened. His memories of their father were hazier. He could construct a version of events where he was less connected to the tragedy. Sophie didn't have that luxury. She remembered everything. Her father's voice. The way he'd tuck her in at night. The plans they'd made for the treehouse that never got built. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. Twice a week she'd sit in an office that smelled like lavender and try to articulate feelings that didn't have adequate words. How do you explain the guilt of being relieved your mother was in prison because it meant you were safe from her manipulation? How do you mourn a father while also mourning the mother who is still alive but lost to you forever? "Do you think I should visit her?" Sophie asked during one session. "Do you want to?" The therapist replied. "I don't know. Part of me wants to understand why she did it. But part of me is scared she'll try to manipulate me again. You're allowed to protect yourself. Even from your mother." The permission helped. Sophie decided not to visit. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Mara sent letters that Sophie left unopened. They accumulated in a box in her closet. Evidence of a relationship that existed only in the past tense. Her uncle was kind, but overwhelmed. He'd never had children of his own. Suddenly, he was raising two traumatized teenagers and had no framework for how to do it right. He provided stability, food and shelter, and rides to school. But he couldn't provide healing. That was something Sophie and her brother had to find themselves. Sophie threw herself into academics. Straight A's, perfect attendance, college applications that read like someone trying to escape through achievement. She got accepted to schools across the country. Chose one as far from Pine Hollow as geography allowed. A fresh start where no one would know her story unless she chose to tell it. The night before leaving for college, she visited her father's grave. The headstone was simple. Ethan Rowe, beloved father. 1978 to 2016. The dates reduced a life to a dash. Everything he'd been existed in that small space between birth and death. "I'm going to be okay," Sophie told the headstone. "I know you worried about us, but we're going to be okay." She didn't know if that was true, but saying it out loud made it feel possible. She could build a life her father would be proud of, could become someone defined by more than tragedy, could honor him by surviving the thing that was supposed to destroy her. David visited Ethan's grave regularly. He'd been the one to push for the investigation, to believe Sophie when she'd shown him the video, to refuse to accept the easy explanations. Now Ethan had a proper burial, a place people could visit, recognition that his life and death mattered. But David couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more sooner. If he'd pushed harder in those first months, if he'd convinced police to investigate when the text messages first seemed wrong, maybe Ethan would have been found years earlier. Maybe Sophie and her brother would have had some portion of their childhood not defined by uncertainty. "I'm sorry I didn't figure it out faster," David said to the headstone. "I should have known. Should have done something." The guilt was irrational. He'd done everything a friend could reasonably do. But grief and guilt don't follow rational rules. They exist in a space where should-haves multiply endlessly and nothing you actually did feels sufficient. His wife worried about his obsession with the case. "You need to let it go," she'd say gently. "Ethan's at rest. Mara's in prison. There's nothing left to fix." But David couldn't let it go. He joined online communities focused on missing persons cases, spent hours reading about other disappearances, other families searching for answers, other people buried in backyards or shallow graves or places no one thought to look. He became one of those people who saw patterns everywhere, who noticed when someone went missing and immediately suspected the spouse, who couldn't watch crime shows without critiquing the investigation, who'd been changed by proximity to violence in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "It could happen to anyone," he'd tell his wife. "That's what scares me. Ethan was just a normal guy, lived a normal life, and someone he trusted murdered him. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone." She didn't argue, just held his hand and let him process the fear that came from learning the world was more dangerous than he'd believed. That evil didn't announce itself. That people capable of murder often looked exactly like everyone else. The true crime community that formed around these cases was massive. Podcasters covered every detail. YouTubers analyzed evidence. Reddit threads debated theories. Thousands of strangers invested in stories about people they'd never met, searching for meaning in tragedies that resisted meaning. Some of this attention helped, kept pressure on investigators, raised awareness about warning signs, provided community for grieving families who felt alone in their loss. But some of it was exploitative. People consuming tragedy as entertainment, making jokes about murder, treating real deaths like plot points in a TV show. Katia received messages from true crime enthusiasts asking for interviews, wanting to hear about Irina's final days, requesting photos. Some were respectful, others were ghoulish. She blocked most of them, eventually deleted her social media entirely, chose privacy over keeping Irina's memory public. "People think they're helping by staying interested," she told a grief counselor. "But they're not interested in my sister. They're interested in the story, in the drama. They want entertainment." The counselor nodded. "You get to control the narrative. You don't owe anyone access to your grief." She kept Irina's journals in a locked drawer. Sometimes she'd take them out and read entries at random. Her sister's handwriting was enthusiastic, loops and flourishes that suggested someone who approached life with energy. The contrast between the hopeful words on the page and the knowledge of how the story ended made the journals almost unbearable to read. One entry, dated 3 weeks before Irina died, described a sunset she'd watched from a beach. "The sky turned colors I've never seen before. Pink and orange and this shade of purple that doesn't exist in Moscow. I felt so small in the best way. Like my problems didn't matter because the universe was so much bigger than me. I want to feel this way forever." Katia closed the journal and put it back in the drawer. Irina had felt small in a way that brought peace. Now she was small in a way that meant gone, reduced to remains in a grave, a name on a headstone, memories that would fade as people who knew her died. On the anniversary of Irina's death, Katia flew back to Azure Coast Island. She visited the grave where her sister's body had been found. Someone had placed flowers there. She never learned who. Maybe other travelers who'd heard the story. Maybe locals who felt guilty that violence had happened in their paradise. She sat on the ground and talked to the air, told Irina about work, about their parents aging, about the cat that still waited by the door some evenings as if expecting Irina to come home. One-sided conversations that felt necessary even though they changed nothing. "I'm angry at you sometimes," Katia said out loud. "For trusting him. For going into that car. For not seeing what he was. then immediately felt guilty for blaming her sister for her own murder. But grief was complicated. It held contradictions. She could simultaneously miss Irina desperately and be furious at the choices that led to her death. Both feelings were real. Both were valid. Before leaving the island, Katia visited the guest house where Irina had stayed. The family remembered her. The daughter was a teenager now. She brought out a drawing she'd made years ago. A stick figure with long hair labeled Irina, standing next to a stick figure labeled me. "She was nice to me," the girl said. "I drew this the day before she went hiking. I was going to give it to her when she came back." Katia took the drawing, added it to the collection of Irina's belongings she kept like religious relics. Every object that had touched her sister's life became sacred. Proof that she'd existed. That she'd mattered to people beyond just family. The flight back to Moscow felt longer than it should have. Katia watched clouds through the window and thought about all the people currently traveling alone. Trusting strangers. Believing in human goodness. Some would be fine. Most would be fine. But some wouldn't. And there was no way to know which until it was too late. Back in Pine Hollow, Sophie was learning to live with being the girl whose mother killed her father. She'd changed schools, but the story followed her. Someone always knew. Would whisper to friends. Point her out in hallways. Reduce her entire existence to the worst thing that had ever happened to her family. Her brother dealt with it differently. He was younger when it happened. His memories of their father were hazier. He could construct a version of events where he was less connected to the tragedy. Sophie didn't have that luxury. She remembered everything. Her father's voice. The way he'd tuck her in at night. The plans they'd made for the treehouse that never got built. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. Twice a week she'd sit in an office that smelled like lavender and try to articulate feelings that didn't have adequate words. How do you explain the guilt of being relieved your mother was in prison because it meant you were safe from her manipulation? How do you mourn a father while also mourning the mother who is still alive but lost to you forever? "Do you think I should visit her?" Sophie asked during one session. "Do you want to?" The therapist replied. "I don't know. Part of me wants to understand why she did it. But part of me is scared she'll try to manipulate me again. You're allowed to protect yourself. Even from your mother." The permission helped. Sophie decided not to visit. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Mara sent letters that Sophie left unopened. They accumulated in a box in her closet. Evidence of a relationship that existed only in the past tense. Her uncle was kind, but overwhelmed. He'd never had children of his own. Suddenly, he was raising two traumatized teenagers and had no framework for how to do it right. He provided stability, food and shelter, and rides to school. But he couldn't provide healing. That was something Sophie and her brother had to find themselves. Sophie threw herself into academics. Straight A's, perfect attendance, college applications that read like someone trying to escape through achievement. She got accepted to schools across the country. Chose one as far from Pine Hollow as geography allowed. A fresh start where no one would know her story unless she chose to tell it. The night before leaving for college, she visited her father's grave. The headstone was simple. Ethan Rowe, beloved father. 1978 to 2016, the dates reduced a life to a dash. Everything he'd been existed in that small space between birth and death. "I'm going to be okay," Sophie told the headstone. "I know you worried about us, but we're going to be okay." She didn't know if that was true, but saying it out loud made it feel possible. She could build a life her father would be proud of, could become someone defined by more than tragedy, could honor him by surviving the thing that was supposed to destroy her. David visited Ethan's grave regularly. He'd been the one to push for the investigation, to believe Sophie when she'd shown him the video, to refuse to accept the easy explanations. Now Ethan had a proper burial, a place people could visit, recognition that his life and death mattered. But David couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more sooner. If he'd pushed harder in those first months. If he'd convinced police to investigate when the text messages first seemed wrong. Maybe Ethan would have been found years earlier. Maybe Sophie and her brother would have had some portion of their childhood not defined by uncertainty. "I'm sorry I didn't figure it out faster," David said to the headstone. "I should have known. Should have done something." The guilt was irrational. He'd done everything a friend could reasonably do. But grief and guilt don't follow rational rules. They exist in a space where should-haves multiply endlessly and nothing you actually did feels sufficient. His wife worried about his obsession with the case. "You need to let it go," she'd say gently. "Ethan's at rest. Mara's in prison. There's nothing left to fix. But David couldn't let it go. He joined online communities focused on missing persons cases, spent hours reading about other disappearances, other families searching for answers, other people buried in backyards or shallow graves or places no one thought to look. He became one of those people who saw patterns everywhere, who noticed when someone went missing and immediately suspected the spouse, who couldn't watch crime shows without critiquing the investigation, who'd been changed by proximity to violence in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It could happen to anyone, he'd tell his wife. That's what scares me. Ethan was just a normal guy, lived a normal life, and someone he trusted murdered him. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. She didn't argue, just held his hand and let him process the fear that came from learning the world was more dangerous than he'd believed. That evil didn't announce itself. That people capable of murder often looked exactly like everyone else. The true crime community that formed around these cases was massive. Podcasters covered every detail. YouTubers analyzed evidence. Reddit threads debated theories. Thousands of strangers invested in stories about people they'd never met, searching for meaning in tragedies that resisted meaning. Some of this attention helped, kept pressure on investigators, raised awareness about warning signs, provided community for grieving families who felt alone in their loss. But some of it was exploitative. People consuming tragedy as entertainment, making jokes about murder, treating real deaths like plot points in a TV show. Katia received messages from true crime enthusiasts asking for interviews, wanting to hear about Irina's final days, requesting photos. Some were respectful, others were ghoulish. She blocked most of them, eventually deleted her social media entirely, chose privacy over keeping Irina's memory public. People think they're helping by staying interested, she told a grief counselor. But they're not interested in my sister. They're interested in the story, in the drama. They want entertainment. The counselor nodded. You get to control the narrative. You don't owe anyone access to your grief. She kept Irina's journals in a locked drawer. Sometimes she'd take them out and read entries at random. Her sister's handwriting was enthusiastic, loops and flourishes that suggested someone who approached life with energy. The contrast between the hopeful words on the page and the knowledge of how the story ended made the journals almost unbearable to read. One entry, dated 3 weeks before Irina died, described a sunset she'd watched from a beach. The sky turned colors I've never seen before. Pink and orange and this shade of purple that doesn't exist in Moscow. I felt so small in the best way. Like my problems didn't matter because the universe was so much bigger than me. I want to feel this way forever. Katia closed the journal and put it back in the drawer. Irina had felt small in a way that brought peace. Now she was small in a way that meant gone. Reduced to remains in a grave. A name on a headstone. Memories that would fade as people who knew her died. On the anniversary of Irina's death, Katia flew back to Azure Coast Island. She visited the grave where her sister's body had been found. Someone had placed flowers there. She never learned who. Maybe other travelers who'd heard the story. Maybe locals who felt guilty that violence had happened in their paradise. She sat on the ground and talked to the air. Told Irina about work. About their parents aging. About the cat that still waited by the door some evenings as if expecting Irina to come home. One-sided conversations that felt necessary even though they changed nothing. I'm angry at you sometimes, Katia said out loud. For trusting him. For going into that car. For not seeing what he was. Then immediately felt guilty for blaming her sister for her own murder. But grief was complicated. It held contradictions. She could simultaneously miss Irina desperately and be furious at the choices that led to her death. Both feelings were real. Both were valid. Before leaving the island, Katia visited the guest house where Irina had stayed. The family remembered her. The daughter was a teenager now. She brought out a drawing she'd made years ago. A stick figure with long hair labeled Irina, standing next to a stick figure labeled me. She was nice to me, the girl said. I drew this the day before she went hiking. I was going to give it to her when she came back. Katia took the drawing, added it to the collection of Irina's belongings she kept like religious relics. Every object that had touched her sister's life became sacred. Proof that she'd existed. That she'd mattered to people beyond just family. The flight back to Moscow felt longer than it should have. Katia watched clouds through the window and thought about all the people currently traveling alone. Trusting strangers. Believing in human goodness. Some would be fine. Most would be fine. But some wouldn't. and there was no way to know which until it was too late. Back in Pine Hollow, Sophie was learning to live with being the girl whose mother killed her father. She'd changed schools, but the story followed her. Someone always knew, would whisper to friends, point her out in hallways, reduce her entire existence to the worst thing that had ever happened to her family. Her brother dealt with it differently. He was younger when it happened. His memories of their father were hazier. He could construct a version of events where he was less connected to the tragedy. Sophie didn't have that luxury. She remembered everything. Her father's voice, the way he'd tuck her in at night, the plans they'd made for the treehouse that never got built. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. Twice a week she'd sit in an office that smelled like lavender and try to articulate feelings that didn't have adequate words. How do you explain the guilt of being relieved your mother was in prison because it meant you were safe from her manipulation? How do you mourn a father while also mourning the mother who is still alive but lost to you forever? Do you think I should visit her? Sophie asked during one session. Do you want to? The therapist replied. I don't know. Part of me wants to understand why she did it. But part of me is scared she'll try to manipulate me again. You're allowed to protect yourself, even from your mother. The permission helped. Sophie decided not to visit. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Mara sent letters that Sophie left unopened. They accumulated in a box in her closet. Evidence of a relationship that existed only in the past tense. Her uncle was kind, but overwhelmed. He'd never had children of his own. Suddenly, he was raising two traumatized teenagers and had no framework for how to do it right. He provided stability, food and shelter, and rides to school. But he couldn't provide healing. That was something Sophie and her brother had to find themselves. Sophie threw herself into academics. Straight A's, perfect attendance, college applications that read like someone trying to escape through achievement. She got accepted to schools across the country. Chose one as far from Pine Hollow as geography allowed. A fresh start where no one would know her story unless she chose to tell it. The night before leaving for college, she visited her father's grave. The headstone was simple. Ethan Rowe, beloved father. 1978 to 2016. The dates reduced a life to a dash. Everything he'd been existed in that small space between birth and death. I'm going to be okay, Sophie told the headstone. I know you worried about us, but we're going to be okay. She didn't know if that was true, but saying it out loud made it feel possible. She could build a life her father would be proud of, could become someone defined by more than tragedy, could honor him by surviving the thing that was supposed to destroy her. David visited Ethan's grave regularly. He'd been the one to push for the investigation, to believe Sophie when she'd shown him the video, to refuse to accept the easy explanations. Now Ethan had a proper burial, a place people could visit, recognition that his life and death mattered. But David couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more sooner. If he'd pushed harder in those first months, if he'd convinced police to investigate when the text messages first seemed wrong, maybe Ethan would have been found years earlier. Maybe Sophie and her brother would have had some portion of their childhood not defined by uncertainty. I'm sorry I didn't figure it out faster, David said to the headstone. I should have known. Should have done something. The guilt was irrational. He'd done everything a friend could reasonably do. But grief and guilt don't follow rational rules. They exist in a space where should-haves multiply endlessly and nothing you actually did feels sufficient. His wife worried about his obsession with the case. You need to let it go, she'd say gently. Ethan's at rest. Mara's in prison. There's nothing left to fix. But David couldn't let it go. He joined online communities focused on missing persons cases. Spent hours reading about other disappearances. Other families searching for answers. Other people buried in backyards or shallow graves or places no one thought to look. He became one of those people who saw patterns everywhere. Who noticed when someone went missing and immediately suspected the spouse. Who couldn't watch crime shows without critiquing the investigation. Who'd been changed by proximity to violence in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It could happen to anyone, he'd tell his wife. That's what scares me. Ethan was just a normal guy. Lived a normal life. And someone he trusted murdered him. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. She didn't argue, just held his hand and let him process the fear that came from learning the world was more dangerous than he'd believed. That evil didn't announce itself. That people capable of murder often looked exactly like everyone else. The true crime community that formed around these cases was massive. Podcasters covered every detail. YouTubers analyzed evidence. Reddit threads debated theories. thousands of strangers invested in stories about people they'd never met, searching for meaning in tragedies that resisted meaning. Some of this attention helped, kept pressure on investigators, raised awareness about warning signs, provided community for grieving families who felt alone in their loss. But some of it was exploitative. People consuming tragedy as entertainment, making jokes about murder, treating real deaths like plot points in a TV show. Katia received messages from true crime enthusiasts asking for interviews, wanting to hear about Irina's final days, requesting photos. Some were respectful, others were ghoulish. She blocked most of them, eventually deleted her social media entirely, chose privacy over keeping Irina's memory public. People think they're helping by staying interested, she told a grief counselor. But they're not interested in my sister. They're interested in the story, in the drama. They want entertainment. The counselor nodded. You get to control the narrative. You don't owe anyone access to your grief. But controlling the narrative was impossible in the age of internet permanence. Irina's case existed in hundreds of forums, video essays, podcast episodes. Strangers discussed her life and death with casual familiarity, debated whether she'd made mistakes, criticized her decision to travel alone, questioned why she'd trusted Arjun. The victim blaming was subtle but pervasive. She should have been more careful. Solo female travelers take risks. Meeting someone from a dating app in a remote location was asking for trouble, as if wanting connection was a crime, as if trusting someone who seemed trustworthy was negligence. Katia wanted to scream at these people, to make them understand that Irina had done nothing wrong, that being murdered wasn't a consequence of poor choices, that the only person responsible for Irina's death was the man who'd killed her. But arguing with strangers on the internet was futile. They'd already decided what they believed. She focused instead on advocacy work, joined organizations supporting victims' families, spoke at conferences about the impact of violence, tried to turn her sister's death into something that might prevent future deaths. It didn't bring Irina back, but it gave purpose to grief that otherwise felt meaningless. In presentations, Katia would show photos of Irina smiling, alive, happy. This is who she was, Katia would say. Not a victim, not a cautionary tale. A person who loved life and trusted too freely because she was good and assumed others were good too. Audiences would nod sympathetically, then ask questions that revealed they hadn't understood at all. What could she have done differently? How can women protect themselves? What are the warning signs? Katia wanted to respond that the warning signs don't matter when someone is skilled at hiding them. That protection is impossible when violence comes from people you're taught to trust. That asking what victims could have done differently places responsibility in the wrong place. But she'd learned to moderate her responses, to be palatable, to package her rage into language that made people feel helpful rather than complicit. It was exhausting, performing grief in ways that made others comfortable with it. Years accumulated. The acute pain of loss became chronic. Something she carried always but learned to function around. She could go days without crying, could talk about Irina without her voice breaking, could see women traveling alone without immediately fearing for their safety. This was healing, apparently. Not forgetting, not moving on, just learning to exist in a world where her sister didn't, where justice had been served but satisfaction remained elusive, where the man who'd killed Irina was in prison and would die there, and it changed nothing about the fundamental unfairness of it all. Maria, Lucia's friend, experienced a different kind of aftermath. She'd lost a friend, not a sister. Her grief was real, but society granted it less legitimacy. No one asked how she was doing after the first few months. People expected her to be fine, to have processed and moved forward. But she dreamed about Lucia regularly. Dreams where Lucia was alive and working the breakfast shift, where they'd split tips and complain about difficult customers and make plans for after work. Then Maria would wake up and remember that Lucia was dead, had been dead for years, would never serve another breakfast or make another plan. The anniversary of Lucia's disappearance haunted Maria. Every year on that date, she'd feel the absence acutely, would remember the morning Lucia hadn't shown up for work, the calls that went unanswered, the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. She visited Lucia's grave when she could, brought flowers, talked about small things, updates about former co-workers, changes at the diner, the mundane details of life continuing without her. Sometimes Lucia's mother would be there. They'd stand together in silence, two women mourning the same person from different angles. She talked about you, Lucia's mother said once. Said you were like a sister. Maria had cried at that. She'd thought of Lucia the same way. More than a coworker. More than a friend. Someone who'd understood her in ways family didn't. And Caleb had taken that relationship away. Had isolated Lucia so thoroughly that Maria hadn't realized how bad things were until it was too late to help. The guilt was irrational but persistent. She should have noticed. Should have pushed harder when Lucia canceled plans. Should have shown up at the apartment uninvited. Should have done something beyond just worrying quietly and hoping things would improve. You couldn't have known, the grief counselor told her. But I suspected, Maria insisted. I saw her changing. I just didn't know what to do about it. You're not responsible for what Caleb did. Intellectually, Maria knew this was true. Emotionally, the guilt remained. She'd failed her friend. Had let social conventions about privacy and not interfering in marriages override her instinct that Lucia was in danger. And by the time intervention became obviously necessary, Lucia was already dead. She channeled the guilt into action, volunteered at a domestic violence shelter, answered crisis hotline calls, helped women create safety plans for leaving dangerous situations. Each person she helped was a small redemption, a way of saving someone the way she hadn't saved Lucia. The work was hard, listening to stories of abuse, watching women return to dangerous partners, knowing that sometimes helping wasn't enough and violence found them anyway. But she kept doing it because the alternative was letting Lucia's death mean nothing beyond personal tragedy. One woman she helped, a young mother with 2 kids, reminded her intensely of Lucia. Same age, same situation, married to a man whose love looked like control, working multiple jobs, afraid but not ready to leave. Maria worked with her for months, helped her save money secretly, arranged temporary housing, coordinated with police for protection. And when the woman finally left, when she and her kids were safe in a new city with new identities, Maria felt something close to peace. You saved my life, the woman told her during their final phone call. No, Maria said. You saved your own life. I just held the door open. But she thought about Lucia, about how if someone had held the door open for her, maybe she would have walked through it. Maybe she'd still be alive, working toward her bookkeeping certification, supporting her grandmother, building the life she'd dreamed about. The maybe haunted Maria. All the parallel universes where things went differently. Where Lucia never met Caleb. Where she left before violence turned lethal. Where someone intervened at exactly the right moment and changed the trajectory of everything. But those universes didn't exist. This one did. The one where Lucia was dead and buried and reduced to memory. Sophie's first year of college was harder than she'd anticipated. She'd thought distance would help. That being somewhere no one knew her story would provide relief. But the trauma traveled with her, lived in her body, emerged in panic attacks during crowded lectures and nightmares about her mother's face during trial. She struggled to connect with other students. They complained about normal things. Roommate conflicts, bad grades, relationship drama. Sophie couldn't relate. Her problems existed on a different scale. She'd testified in her mother's murder trial. Had been manipulated into claiming responsibility for a crime she didn't commit. Had lost both parents in different but equally devastating ways. The University Counseling Center helped somewhat. Weekly therapy sessions where Sophie could process without judgment. Where she didn't have to explain the basics of her trauma. Where the counselor understood that healing wasn't linear, and some days she'd feel functional and others she'd barely get out of bed. I feel broken, Sophie admitted during one session. Like everyone else learned how to be normal, and I missed that lesson. You're not broken, the counselor said. You're traumatized. There's a difference. The distinction mattered. Broken implied unfixable. Traumatized implied wounded but capable of healing. Sophie held on to that difference on hard days. Reminded herself that her brain was responding normally to abnormal circumstances. That the nightmares and anxiety and trust issues were symptoms, not personality defects. She joined a support group for young people who'd lost parents to violence. Hearing other stories helped normalize her experience. She wasn't alone in feeling fundamentally altered by tragedy. Others understood the specific grief of losing a parent to murder. The complexity of mourning while also navigating legal systems and media attention and the judgment of people who thought they understood but didn't. One member of the group had lost both parents in a murder-suicide. Another's father had been killed by a drunk driver who served minimal jail time. Another's mother had been murdered by a stranger during a robbery. Different circumstances, different details, but the same underlying experience of having violence reshape their entire life. But controlling the narrative was impossible. The cases were public record. Court documents were available to anyone who requested them. Photos from the trials circulated online. Irina's face appeared in YouTube thumbnails with titles like "Vacation Turned Deadly" and "She Trusted the Wrong Person." Lucia's story was featured in a true crime series with dramatic reenactments that bore little resemblance to who she actually was. Ethan's case inspired a podcast that spent 8 episodes dissecting every detail of his marriage and murder. The families had no control over any of it. Their loved ones had been transformed into content, characters in other people's stories, reduced to the most sensational aspects of their deaths while the complexity of their lives was ignored. Maria tried listening to the podcast about Lucia once, made it through 10 minutes before turning it off. The host described Lucia as a struggling immigrant, which technically was true but missed everything important. Lucia hadn't been struggling. She'd been working, building, moving toward goals. The word struggling made her sound passive, like life was happening to her rather than her actively shaping it. She was strong, Maria said to no one in particular. That's what people should know. She was strong and she was killed by someone who couldn't stand her strength. But strength didn't make good content. Victimhood did. So the podcasts and videos and articles emphasized Lucia's vulnerability, her isolation, the way she'd been failed by systems and people. They turned her into a cautionary tale instead of a person. The same thing happened to all of them. Ethan became the man buried in his own backyard. Naomi became the patient the hospital lost. Irina became the solo traveler who trusted the wrong man. Marcus became the lonely night shift worker. Noah became the man who lent his truck to a killer. Each description was accurate but incomplete. It captured one dimension while erasing everything else. The way Ethan had measured twice before cutting wood. The way Naomi had loved terrible reality TV shows. The way Irina had collected postcards from every place she visited. The way Marcus had read science fiction and dreamed about Mars. The way Noah had driven with windows down even in winter because he liked the cold air. These details didn't make it into the podcasts. They weren't dramatic enough. Didn't contribute to the narrative arc. So they disappeared, and the people became stories, and the stories became entertainment, and the entertainment became divorced from the reality of human lives, ending violently. Sophie discovered a forum where people debated whether her mother should have received the death penalty. Strangers who'd never met Mara or Ethan or Sophie argued passionately about what justice should look like. Some wanted harsher punishment. Others thought life imprisonment was sufficient. A few suggested Mara had been driven to murder by circumstances no one understood. Sophie read these debates feeling increasingly detached from her own life. These people were discussing her family like a hypothetical, a thought experiment. They had strong opinions about people they'd never met, about situations they'd experienced only through curated media coverage. One comment stayed with her. Someone had written, "The daughter testifying was clearly coached. She seemed robotic. No real emotion." Sophie had been terrified during her testimony, had been shaking so hard the bailiff brought her water, had barely been able to speak without her voice breaking. But to this stranger watching clips online, she'd seemed robotic. Her trauma had been misread as performance. She stopped reading forums after that, stopped Googling her father's name, stopped looking at the news coverage. The public version of her story had nothing to do with her actual experience. Let strangers debate and analyze and theorize. She had to live with the reality they were treating as entertainment. In Montana, Noah occasionally heard other resort workers discussing true crime podcasts. They'd talk about cases during lunch breaks, debate evidence, share theories. He never joined these conversations, never mentioned that he'd been part of a case, that his truck had been evidence, that he knew what it felt like to be on the other side of the microphone. One day a new employee brought up Brielle's case. "Did you hear about this one? Woman used dating apps to target lonely men, stole vehicles, killed at least one guy." While Noah focused on his food and said nothing. "The guy who lent her his truck was an idiot," the employee continued. "Like, how do you not see red flags?" She basically advertised that she was sketchy. Noah's coworker, one of the few people who knew his history, changed the subject quickly. Later, she found Noah in the equipment room. "You okay?" she asked. "People always think they'd see it coming," Noah said. "That they'd be smarter, more careful. They don't understand that manipulation works by making you feel safe, by making you feel seen. You don't notice the red flags because you're too busy feeling grateful that someone finally understands you. You don't have to defend yourself to idiots." "I'm not defending myself. I'm just tired of people treating victims like they deserve what happened because they weren't suspicious enough." He returned to work and tried not to think about the fact that somewhere, people were probably having the same conversation about him, judging his choices, deciding he should have known better, reducing his experience to a failure of judgment rather than acknowledging that sometimes bad people are good at pretending to be safe. The weight of these stories, collectively, began to shift how people thought about relationships and trust. Dating apps added safety features, verification systems, check-in functions that alerted friends if you didn't confirm you were safe after a date. Hospitals implemented new protocols for tracking patients. Police departments trained officers to take domestic violence calls more seriously. These changes helped, statistically, incrementally, but they couldn't prevent all violence. Couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of being human and needing connection with other humans who might betray that need. Advocacy groups used these cases in their awareness campaigns. Photos of victims accompanied by statistics about intimate partner violence, about the dangers of isolation, about warning signs. The intentions were good, but the effect was sometimes to make people more afraid rather than more aware. Young women traveling alone now carried GPS trackers and checked in obsessively with family. People on dating apps ran background checks before meeting for coffee. Neighbors called police at the first sound of raised voices. The world became more suspicious, more cautious. Whether this made people safer or just more isolated was unclear. Elaine's lawyer had pushed for policy changes after Naomi's case. Mandatory notification systems when patients died in hospitals, better tracking procedures, oversight mechanisms to prevent administrative errors from becoming fatal negligence. Some hospitals implemented these changes. Others resisted, citing cost and complexity. "We can't regulate away human error," one hospital administrator said during a policy hearing. "Mistakes will always happen. The best we can do is minimize them." Elaine, sitting in the gallery, had wanted to scream. Naomi wasn't a mistake. She was a person, a daughter, someone who deserved basic competence from the institution claiming to care for her. Minimizing errors meant her death was acceptable collateral damage, a statistically inevitable outcome of an imperfect system. But she'd said nothing, just sat there feeling the weight of knowing that nothing would fundamentally change. Other families would experience what she'd experienced. Other people would die and be lost, and be erased by administrative incompetence. And the system would continue functioning because systems prioritize their own continuation over individual lives. Years passed. The immediate media attention faded. The cases became old news. Podcasts moved on to fresher tragedies. Online communities found new mysteries to dissect. The families were left with their grief while the world's attention moved elsewhere. Sophie graduated college, got a job, built a life that looked normal from the outside. She didn't talk about her parents. When coworkers asked about family, she gave vague answers. "My uncle raised me. My parents aren't in the picture." True enough without inviting follow-up questions. She dated cautiously, took months to trust anyone enough to be vulnerable. When she finally told a boyfriend about her father's murder, he'd Googled it immediately, read articles, watch videos, then looked at her differently, like she was contaminated by proximity to violence. They broke up shortly after. Not because he said anything cruel, just because the knowledge changed how he saw her. She was no longer just Sophie. She was Sophie whose mother killed her father. Sophie who testified in court. Sophie from that case he'd probably heard about years ago and half forgotten. The criminal justice system moved forward with its usual mechanical efficiency. Mara's appeals were denied. Caleb's appeals were denied. Arjun's appeals were denied. Brielle's appeals were denied. The convictions stood. The sentences remained. These people would spend the rest of their lives in prison, removed from society, punished for their crimes. But punishment didn't restore anything, didn't bring back the dead or heal the traumatized. Just confirmed that society took murder seriously enough to lock people away forever. A statement of values that changed nothing about what had already occurred. Victim impact statements had been read at sentencing hearings. Family members describing loss. The empty chairs at holidays. The milestones that would never happen. Graduations and weddings and grandchildren that the murdered would never see. The ripple effects of violence spreading outward through generations. Judges listened and nodded and imposed maximum sentences, as if years in prison could somehow balance the scales, as if there was any sentence that could equal a stolen life. The math didn't work, never would. But courts operated on the fiction that punishment and justice were equivalent. The families of the convicted suffered too, though their pain received less sympathy. Mara's relatives dealt with the shame of being connected to a murderer, avoided social gatherings, changed their names sometimes, moved to new cities where no one knew their connection to the case. One of Mara's cousins spoke to a journalist years after the trial. "I loved her," the cousin said. "That doesn't go away just because of what she did. But I also hate her for it, for destroying our family, for making us all complicit by association. People look at us differently now, like maybe we knew, like maybe we're capable of the same thing." The cousin had cut off all contact with Mara, refused to visit, returned letters unopened. "I can't forgive her. Maybe that makes me a bad person. But she murdered my uncle, buried him in the backyard, made his children think he'd abandoned them. I don't know how to reconcile the person I knew with the person capable of that." This was the particular cruelty of intimate violence. It forced people to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. That someone could be kind to you and murderous to someone else. That love and violence could coexist in the same relationship. That people contained multitudes, some of which were monstrous. Caleb's mother visited him in prison monthly for the first year, then quarterly, then stopped. The journey was too painful. Sitting across from her son, knowing what he'd done, seeing him unchanged, still capable of charm and manipulation, still insisting Lucia had provoked him, still refusing to take full responsibility. "I don't know him anymore," she told her priest. "Or maybe I never knew him. Maybe I only saw what I wanted to see." The priest offered platitudes about forgiveness and God's mercy. But Caleb's mother couldn't find forgiveness. Not for her son. Not for herself for raising someone capable of murder. The guilt was heavy. Had she missed signs? Had she taught him that women existed to serve him? Had her own marriage, traditional and unequal, modeled dynamics he'd replicated with deadly consequences? She attended a support group for families of violent offenders. Sat in circles with other mothers and fathers and siblings who carried similar guilt, who asked the same unanswerable questions. What could we have done differently? How do we not know? Are we responsible for who they became? The group leader, a psychologist specializing in family trauma, was careful to separate responsibility from causation. You didn't make your loved ones commit violence. Their choices were their own. But you're allowed to grieve both the victim and the person you thought you knew. This permission helped. Caleb's mother could mourn Lucia, while also mourning the son she'd thought she had. The boy who'd played soccer and gotten good grades, and seemed normal. That boy was gone. Had maybe never existed. Replaced by the knowledge of what he'd actually been capable of all along. Arjun's family in Mumbai refused to believe the conviction. Insisted he'd been framed. That a good Indian boy wouldn't do such things. That the system had railroaded him because he was brown and foreign and an easy target for a crime someone else committed. They hired lawyers for appeals that went nowhere. Spent their savings on private investigators who found nothing exculpatory. Created websites declaring his innocence. Posted on social media calling for justice. Became conspiracy theorists rather than accept that their son was a murderer. Irina's family watched this with rage and disbelief. Arjun had confessed. Evidence was overwhelming. But his family's denial was absolute. They'd built an alternate reality where he was the victim. Where Irina was somehow responsible. Where the truth was a lie and lies were truth. They need to believe he's innocent, Kadia's therapist explained. Accepting his guilt would destroy their entire understanding of who he is. Some people can't survive that kind of cognitive dissonance. But their denial hurt. Added insult to injury. Turned Kadia's grief into a battleground where she had to defend her sister's innocence while they defended their sons. She blocked them on social media. Refused to engage. Focused on her own healing rather than trying to convince people who'd chosen delusion over reality. Brielle's family had abandoned her long before the trial. She'd been estranged for years, burning through relationships and leaving chaos in her wake. When they learned about Marcus's murder, they weren't surprised. "We knew something like this would happen eventually," her brother told police. "She's been destructive her whole life. We tried to help when she was younger, but she didn't want help. Just wanted what she wanted, no matter who got hurt. He didn't visit her in prison. Didn't write. Didn't maintain any connection. I grieved losing my sister years ago," he said. "This is just confirmation that I was right to cut her off." His coldness shocked people. How could he abandon his own sister? But he'd survived her chaos, had escaped her manipulation, had built a healthy life by removing her from it. He owed her nothing. Certainly not loyalty after she'd murdered someone. Noah struggled with this, with understanding how families could just walk away. His own parents had stood by him during the trial, supported him despite the shame of being publicly connected to a murder case. He couldn't imagine them cutting him off no matter what he'd done. But his therapist explained that each family had its own history, its own breaking point. Brielle's family had probably been dealing with her behavior for decades. The murder was just the final straw. You can't judge them for protecting themselves. Still, Noah felt sad for Brielle in abstract ways. She was clearly disturbed. Personality disordered at minimum. Probably untreated mental illness throughout her life. The system had failed her long before she'd become a murderer. Not that this excused what she'd done, but it complicated the narrative of evil. He wondered sometimes if she thought about Marcus, if she felt remorse, or if she was incapable of that kind of reflection. Sociopaths didn't feel guilt the way normal people did. Their brains processed morality differently. What felt like obvious right and wrong to most people was just strategy to them. He'd read about this obsessively after the trial, trying to understand what he'd encountered. The psychological literature on manipulative personalities. The case studies of people who used others as tools. The research on why some people lacked empathy entirely. It helped somewhat, providing academic framework for his experience. But it also highlighted how vulnerable everyone was. Brielle hadn't looked like a monster. She'd seemed normal, attractive even. Someone you'd swipe right on without hesitation. And that was the terrifying part. Danger didn't announce itself. It often looked like opportunity. The dating apps remained on his phone, undeleted but unopened. Ghosts of a different life. When he looked at them, he felt physical revulsion. The swiping and matching and messaging that had led to Marcus's death and his own near miss. How many other predators lurked there? How many other Brielles creating profiles designed to attract exactly the kind of person they intended to victimize? His co-worker, the one who'd driven him to retrieve his truck, suggested therapy might help him trust again. "Not everyone is dangerous," he'd said. "You just had spectacularly bad luck." But Noah couldn't separate bad luck from bad judgment. He'd ignored red flags, had wanted connections so desperately that he'd overlooked inconsistencies, had handed over his truck to someone he barely knew. Those were choices, ones he'd made, ones that had consequences beyond just his own life. The guilt about Marcus never fully faded. He knew intellectually that Brielle was responsible, that he'd been manipulated. That victim blaming himself was irrational. But the feeling persisted anyway. Marcus had died partly because Noah's truck had been available, because Brielle had used it to scout locations and establish patterns and create the infrastructure for murder. If Noah had been less lonely, less trusting, less willing to believe that someone who seemed perfect actually was perfect, then maybe Brielle would have moved on to a different target. Maybe Marcus would still be alive. Maybe Noah's choices had determined who lived and who died, even though he'd never intended any harm. His therapist challenged this. "You're giving yourself too much power." Brielle would have found another way. Another truck. Another victim. Predators don't stop because one opportunity disappears. They adapt. Logically, Noah knew this was true. But logic and emotion operated on different tracks. He could understand he wasn't responsible while still feeling responsible. Both things existed simultaneously. The rational knowledge and the irrational guilt. Years became decades. The sharp edges of grief dulled into something more manageable. Not gone. Never gone. But integrated into lives that continued despite loss. The families learned to function around the absences. To celebrate holidays even though someone was missing. To find joy even though violence had touched them. Sophie became the social worker she'd set out to be. Worked with foster children and trauma survivors. Used her own experience to inform her practice. She wasn't perfect at it. Sometimes she projected her own issues onto clients. Sometimes she took their pain too personally. But she was effective in ways people without lived experience couldn't be. One teenager she worked with, a girl whose mother had killed her father, opened up to Sophie in ways she hadn't with previous counselors. "You actually get it," the girl said. "I can tell. Most people try to understand, but they're just guessing." Sophie never disclosed her full background to clients, maintained boundaries, but she couldn't hide the authenticity that came from shared experience. The way she didn't flinch at difficult disclosures. The way she understood that some days you're functional, and other days you're barely surviving, and both are okay. She'd found therapy helpful enough to pursue her own licensure. Became a therapist specializing in children and adolescents affected by violence. Built a practice around helping young people navigate trauma. Each client she helped felt like honoring her father, like transforming what happened to her family into something that might prevent other families from falling apart the same way. Her brother took a different path, joined the military, found structure and purpose in clear hierarchies and defined missions. He didn't talk about their parents, rarely came home, built a life that had nothing to do with Pine Hollow or the backyard where their father had been buried or the trial that had defined their adolescence. Sophie worried about him, about unprocessed trauma manifesting in other ways. But he seemed okay, functional, maybe even happy. Some people healed through avoidance, through building entirely new identities that weren't connected to their wounds. Who was she to say that was wrong? They talked on holidays, brief calls, updates about work and weather, and nothing substantive. The distance between them wasn't geographic. It was the space created by different coping mechanisms. Sophie had leaned into her trauma. Her brother had run from it. Both strategies were valid. Both were survival. David retired from the aviation facility, moved to a smaller town, kept visiting Ethan's grave, but less frequently. The ritual had served its purpose, helped him process, but he didn't need it the same way anymore. Ethan was at rest. David had done everything he could. It was time to let go. His wife was relieved. "You've been carrying this for so long," she said. "You can put it down now." He tried, focused on grandchildren and hobbies and the ordinary pleasures of retirement. But sometimes he'd see a news story about a missing person and feel that familiar pull, the urge to investigate, to push for answers, to refuse to accept easy explanations. The cases never really left you. Once you'd seen behind the curtain of how easily people disappeared, how readily society accepted convenient narratives, you couldn't unsee it. David looked at the world differently now, noticed absences, questioned official stories, maintained healthy skepticism about what he was told. Katia eventually returned to traveling. Not solo. She'd lost her appetite for that. But with friends, in groups, to places that felt safe. She'd never recover the optimism Irina had traveled with. That belief in universal human goodness. But she could still appreciate beauty, still find joy in new experiences, still honor her sister by experiencing the world they'd both loved. She scattered some of Irina's ashes in places her sister had wanted to visit but never got to. Mountains in Nepal, beaches in Thailand, cities across Europe. Each location became a small memorial, a way of completing journeys Irina had planned but would never take. "I'm taking you with me," Katia would whisper, releasing ashes into wind or water. "You don't get to see it, but you're here anyway." It helped, creating rituals around loss, finding ways to include the dead in the ongoing life of the living. Irina was gone, but her presence remained in Katia's choices, the places she visited, the care she took, the way she honored her sister's memory by living fully even when living was difficult. Maria stayed in domestic violence work until it broke her. 20 years of helping women escape dangerous situations, of watching some succeed and others return to their abusers, of knowing that no matter how hard she worked, violence would continue, that she couldn't save everyone, couldn't even save most people. She burned out spectacularly, stopped showing up to work, stopped answering her phone, spent weeks in bed unable to move. Secondary trauma, her therapist called it. Vicarious traumatization from absorbing other people's pain for decades. She took a year off, traveled, rested, tried to remember who she was before she defined herself entirely through helping others. It was harder than expected. She'd built her identity around being useful, around preventing other people from ending up like Lucia. Without that purpose, she felt empty. But slowly, she found other things. Gardening, painting, a book club, small pleasures that had nothing to do with trauma or violence or saving anyone. She learned that healing required not just processing pain, but actively cultivating joy. that she couldn't live entirely in the space of other people's suffering. She never fully left advocacy work, just scaled back, consulted on policy, trained new crisis counselors, shared her expertise without absorbing frontline trauma. It was sustainable in ways her previous work hadn't been, allowed her to contribute without destroying herself. On Lucia's birthday each year, Maria would make her favorite meal, empanadas and rice and tres leches cake. She'd set a place at the table and eat in companionable silence with Lucia's memory. It was ritual, remembrance, a way of saying you mattered and I haven't forgotten and you deserved so much more than what you got. The families of the convicted navigated their own complicated grief. Mara's relatives mourned the person they'd thought they knew, struggled with shame and anger and confusion. Some went to therapy, others just endured. There was no roadmap for loving someone who'd committed murder, no clear path through the contradictions. Caleb's mother died without ever reconciling what her son had done. She visited his grave with the kind of love that survives even unforgivable actions. She'd given birth to him, raised him. That bond didn't disappear just because he'd become a monster. But she also carried guilt to her own grave. Questions about what she'd missed, what she might have done differently. Arjun's family maintained his innocence until evidence became completely overwhelming. Then they simply stopped talking about it, pretended he'd never existed, removed his photos from their home, spoke of him only in past tense if forced to acknowledge him at all. Grief expressed through erasure. Brielle's family felt vindicated. They'd cut her off years ago, had predicted her trajectory would end in disaster. The murder confirmed their worst suspicions. But vindication brought no joy, just the heavy knowledge that they'd been right about their own family member being dangerous. The justice system moved on to new cases. Prosecutors who'd handled these trials moved up to higher positions or retired. Defense attorneys took new clients. Judges presided over different murders. The machinery of justice ground forward, processing violence with mechanical efficiency. But for the families, time moved differently. The trials might have ended, but the trauma continued. Grief had no statute of limitations, no appeals process, no sentence that eventually got served and completed. It was life without parole in a different sense, a permanent condition that required daily management. Support groups helped some people. Therapy helped others. Some found religion. Others found meaning in advocacy work. A few found nothing that helped and simply endured. Survived because the alternative was giving up entirely, and they weren't ready for that. The true crime industry continued exploiting these stories. New podcasts launched. YouTube channels devoted entire series to analyzing the cases. Netflix produced documentaries. Each retelling claimed to offer new insights, but mostly just repackaged the same information for new audiences hungry for tragedy. Some families cooperated with media, hoping that keeping their loved one's story alive might prevent future violence. Others refused all interviews, chose privacy over publicity. There was no right answer, just different strategies for coping with unwanted fame. The cases became teaching tools. Law students studied the trials. Psychology programs used them as examples of various pathologies. Criminology courses analyzed the investigations. The human beings at the center became abstractions, case studies, learning opportunities for people who'd never met them and never would. But in quiet moments, in private spaces, the grief remained intensely personal. Katia looking at photos of Irina and crying. Sophie visiting her father's grave and talking to stone. Maria cooking empanadas for a friend who'd never eat them. David driving past Ethan's old house and remembering the man who'd measured everything twice. These moments of private mourning were where the real truth lived. Not in courtrooms or podcasts or documentaries, but in the persistent ache of absence. The way holidays felt wrong. The way certain songs or smells or random moments could trigger overwhelming sadness. The way healing was possible, but wholeness wasn't. Like the video, and subscribe if you want more stories like this. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what case affected you most. We'll be back soon with more true crime stories. Until then, stay safe out there. Remember that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like love. Sometimes it looks like opportunity. Sometimes it looks exactly like what you've been searching for. Trust your instincts. Tell people where you're going. And know that if something feels wrong, you don't owe anyone the benefit of the doubt. Your safety matters more than politeness. These cases remind us that violence hides in plain sight, that systems fail, that justice can't undo harm, that the people we trust are sometimes the most dangerous. Not to make you paranoid, just to make you careful, to make you aware that the world contains both beauty and horror, often in the same spaces. The families featured in these stories didn't ask for any of this. They were just ordinary people whose lives intersected with violence and were forever changed by it. They're still here, still grieving, still learning to live with what happened. And they deserve to be remembered not just as victims or survivors, but as whole human beings navigating impossible circumstances. So remember Ethan, remember Lucia, remember Naomi, remember Marcus, remember Irina. Not just how they died, but that they lived, that they mattered, that their absence created holes that can never be filled. And remember that every true crime story is someone's actual life, someone's actual loss. Not entertainment, not a puzzle to solve, but real human suffering that deserves respect and dignity, even as we try to learn from it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next one.